So we're going to start. Hello, everyone. My name is Ramona Gânțol, and I'm an associate professor in Romanian at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies here at UCL. And I'm also the convener of the PROLang group, which I could tell you about later. We're very pleased to have you all here today for the second PROLang Symposium on Decolonising Language Studies, this time co-organized with the Institute of Advanced Studies. Today's event follows yesterday's similar event at the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies. Thank you, Professor Burdett, for the great collaboration we are building. We have a stellar line of presenters and discussants here today, and thank you all for being here. We will have a Q&A session at the end. For the audience online, please type your questions in the Q&A box. We will answer them at the end, and we are also recording the event. Esther and Jelena will convene the event, but we will start with Professor Peter Zusi, our SSEES colleague and Vice Dean for Research Innovation and Enterprise for the Arts and Humanities faculty. Thank you, Peter, for making time in a very busy schedule, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ramona. It's really it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you all here, sort of on behalf of the IAS. It's great that they're involved, and in particular, my colleagues from SSEES, who have done an extraordinary job organizing this single event, but within a series of further events, and also the PROLang structure within which this is taking place. So congratulations to Esther and Jelena and Ramona. It's really, I think, an excellent initiative. In some ways, it's very reflective, and now I'm sort of putting on my cap as a SSEES colleague. It's very reflective of the research ethos at SSEES, where we do take seriously sort of what are oftentimes called, in inverted commas, small languages and cultures. And I think that this initiative has shown a really effective way of showing how that that priority is extremely important, not just to sort of keep some little flame going somewhere, but because of the ways that sort of deeply imbibed or imbued biases and frameworks have fit into the way that study and research is constructed. So I think, you know, this event today is really interesting to me in the way that it combines sort of research questions, practical methodological questions, but also invites reflection on sort of structures within which we carry out our research, and the types of questions we ask. So I think that is really, really important. That's, I think, all I'm going to say by way of introduction. I have to apologize because I have to run to another meeting, which I'm supposed to be running, and I still am not quite sure what I'm doing. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be here with you today, although this will be recorded. So I will definitely be here in spirit afterwards. I took part in the first event in the spring. Virtually, I was in New York at the time, and it was great. And I think you're planning on sort of combining these eventually into a larger symposium. That
together with hopefully the Institute for Languages, Cultures.
Yeah. So I think this is really an exciting initiative, and I hope you all have a great afternoon, which I'm sure you will. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so I am the third to welcome you, and I thank the other two people who welcomed you, and certainly Ramona, who within PROLang inspired us to initiate this series of symposia. Now, the symposia have been in the air and on our minds for a long time, because at SSEES, many of us are working in language endangerment, language typology, sociolinguistics, critical sociolinguistics, and linguistic ethnography, while we also teach language. And many of us from these disciplinary backgrounds were struck by that strange tension between teaching a language as a national named language according to the laws of the way that occurs, while theoretically being aligned to very different ways of thinking about languages and embracing the fuzziness that does not allow for such a neat way of construing language. In a way, when we started talking about, hello, welcome to Professor Phipps. So when decolonizing initiatives came about and started being talked about more closely, also within our narrower department, SSEES, we were very excited by this potential, or we were very much excited by the potential in the concept. Although East European languages, if we can call them that, cannot be thought of as colonial languages if we take a narrow understanding of colonialism. But in terms of the power alignment and the dynamics, the language ideological dynamics that underline the offering of these languages in our institutional setting, and also the way these languages struggle with their own monolingual traditions in the region, provide very much ground for us exploring these languages and the construction, the ideological construction of these languages in the classroom in terms of the colonial or rather decolonial tradition. So we at SSEES contributed ideas about enhanced community involvement in our delivery of language curriculum targets in two main ways. Here I'm not mentioning publications, I'm concentrating mostly on teaching projects. So the first approach was projects with schools with high percent of East European learners, particularly with Bulgarian and Romanian background speakers or learners whose home languages are Bulgarian and Romanian. And my colleagues, Jordanka Velkova and Ramona Göncel, have collaborated with such schools to explore pathways to assessment, which formally recognize these learner skills in their home languages. Ramona is going to say to you a word about this in a minute. Now, our other or second approach to thinking about decolonization was to propose a community-centered ethnographic approach to learning languages in higher education, which draws learners and community-based speakers' attention to linguistic citizenship and values various types of knowledge alongside academic knowledge, as well as various ways of speaking that are not necessarily bound to named languages of European nation states. Before I move on, I want to ask Ramona to say about the PEAL initiative a sentence.
Thank you, Esther.
Just one sentence.
Yeah, so PEAL stands for Proficiency in East European Languages, and it's an outreach project where we work with 3 schools at the moment because it's a kind of new project, but it has scope to expand nationally. We cover 3 languages. So initially it was Romanian and Bulgarian. We added Ukrainian. And the main scope of the project is going to encourage students to maintain their heritage language abroad and be proud of their languages, to introduce students to the idea of the university and the fact that they could do degrees in these languages, and to build evidence for hopefully the future introduction of GCSEs in some of the community languages in the near future. So I could talk more about it later, but that's enough now. Thank you.
More will be for the roundtable discussion and maybe for future discussions to come, probably in less formal settings as well. Now, the other incentive, the one that focuses on languages in higher education, involved encouraging our students to do ethnographic projects as part of their learning Hungarian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Finnish, Ukrainian, perhaps even Russian in the future, in London. This is sort of a tried and tested method, which with a few of my colleagues, including linguists and anthropologists, we tried during a series of summer schools that we led for the UCL Global Citizenship Office between 2013 and 2019. And it's lovely to see some people who were involved with the courses that sort of followed on as mainstream academic courses based on the summer school experience. And the idea is basically that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So in the teaching of what we call foreign languages, in the higher education sector, where many of our languages are offered on ab initio courses. Obviously, grammar is unavoidable, so the teaching of scientific grammar, let's say, is unavoidable. But it should be combined with ethnographic insights that can only be gained through fieldwork that our students can do in the communities in London, engaging with those communities and gauging their opinion of what those communities would like to see about themselves represented in academic fora. So our students could choose from projects such as doing ethnographic interviews or examining the linguistic landscape of, say, a Serbian shop or a Finnish church or a Romanian church for that matter. And in our spring symposium, some of our students brought their results to discuss to the table. And today there are no students involved because they are just settling into the academic year, so there are no projects to present at present. So both approaches, both PEAL and, let's say, ethnographic language learning are participatory in their stance, as long as they take into account the communities and the students' needs and try to engage them, try to increase, let's say, or try to focus on students' agency and on community members' agency in equal measure, at least in principle. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about today's workshop, whose aim is actually to go beyond these principles a little bit that we discussed in the spring and that we have read about in the literature and that we are constantly engaging in. And we would like to build on the experience of our students who presented on the May Symposium and on their small-scale linguistic ethnographic projects in the London-based communities of the languages they study. So some of us following the student projects also experimented with including the students' research in oral assessment. So, for example, a part of my assessment methods on the Hungarian oral exams was for students to give a brief account of what kind of project they did, who they met, or what kind of visual artifact they looked at, in my case, in a Hungarian shop, and explain how that experience was relevant to their learning. What is it about Hungarian that they learned by engaging with these speakers or with these visual representations of language in London? Notice they didn't need to go abroad. And I found that this project provided a forum for a more dynamic form of assessment, which is not bound by, a certain set of criteria, a certain set of topics. Of course, examinations are evaluated against a criteria, and that can't change because that's how we are used to it. But students had greater agency in filling the exam with content. So the content was not premediated by me, and everybody could adapt the project according to their needs and interests. And I think my colleagues who involved it in assessment, like Jelena, I think had a similar experience. We would like to see these steps as only the first ones towards curriculum reform in higher education in the delivery of what we call foreign language programs, which are not aligned with received ideas of linguistic normativity, typically enshrined in written or speaking conventions of the nation states where these languages are official languages. So to reiterate, while we strongly believe that the scientific teaching of grammar should be an integral part of the foreign language curriculum, we advocate for the inclusion of an ethnographic and participatory approach alongside classroom-based learning. We have outlined in a brief to students and colleagues last year what this would mean in practice. This brief is available. We would love to share this more widely with colleagues and discuss what other student projects can be imagined. If you would like to read our brief, what we gave to our students, it's here. So probably I could ask you to pass it around and people can just pick up a copy. I just have to say that Jelena's organization of handouts and correspondence is absolutely amazing and kind of mind-boggling. So we will have to return to that point with a huge applause. So there was our brief. And then based on we would like to share these ideas more broadly, and then based on feedback from colleagues, we would like to refine these recommendations for student research projects and include the ethnographic component in oral assessment and potentially in the essay writing component as well. We would like to investigate during the discussion today, so in the last part of the day, what the possibilities and institutional challenges to this are, because the challenges are exciting, they are exciting to talk about because they are constructive. Now, we believe that the ethnographic research component would benefit learners and teachers also in the current environment when we are all learning about, while also sort of feeling a bit concerned about the use of artificial intelligence. This is particularly challenging in the teaching of translation. I can see some of my colleagues nodding. Whoever teach a foreign language, I think can, unavoidably we come across stuff that is written by not human beings. That's also true of essays, of course. And we believe that ethnography can be a kind of a remedy for that, because it is just content that is subject to ethnographic serendipity, and therefore it is perhaps more difficult to reproduce by artificial tools, although the possibilities I know are boundless. So I'm going to stop it there. Jelena is going to chair today's event, and I would like to thank her really for doing all the hard work behind this in terms of correspondence and preparing the practicalities, as well as for my colleagues from SSEES who are here, and also those SSEES external speakers who are kind enough to give up their time from their busy schedule today to be with us. So I'm going to stop it there, and I will hand it over to Jelena.
Thank you, Esther, for these kind words and the presentation of the work that's been that we've done so far. And thank you all for coming and for all the support that you are giving to us. Just to say, I will be very brief. So we will hear three keynote addresses first. So Professor Levey, Alison Phipps, and Victoria Odeni, and we will have a break after this, and we will then invite our discussants to give a feedback on the keynotes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So there will be a break around 3:45 approximately. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Levey.
So I'm going to operate the PowerPoint here. First of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here. And for those colleagues here who are not within UCL, the work in SSEES, as described by Esther just now, is absolutely wonderful. It's amazing. It's exciting. It's transformative. It's highly original. I really urge you to learn more about that work. I think it's going to have quite a long-lasting impact in the way we teach languages and cultures. The SSEES, of course, is unique. Not only in this country, I think in the world as well. What they do is absolutely fascinating. Speaking on the queue for participation and participatory work, I'm going to talk a little bit about participatory linguistics, what we've been doing as part of a previously funded AHRC project within the translanguaging framework. I do see translanguaging as a decolonizing project. So that's again the connection with the theme of today. I will also move on to say something about the actual practical work we're doing in the IOE regarding language education in schools and also in higher education in our own context towards the end. I'm afraid I have another event to go to at the British Academy, and I need to leave at 3:30 the latest, so I won't be able to. I hope I will be able to see to hear Alison and Victoria's presentations. I'm sure they will be much more interesting and exciting visually and content-wise than mine. But I will miss the critical comments from Ben and others.
We're not going to this stuff because we will record the event.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, because that in many ways is going to be the most important rewarding part, especially those constructive comments. So yes, let me start with the the responsibilities of language researchers, what we see as the social responsibilities, what we do in sociolinguistics, in applied linguistics especially, but actually really anybody concerned with language work. I think it's really important that we remind ourselves that we are not just doing a basic teaching or analysis of linguistic structures as such. I think it's important to see our role as contributing to social justice through investigating and understanding linguistic practices, language practices of the people who are using these languages. Sorry, I mean, slightly kind of.
I mean,
Yes, I mean,
refer to situation.
yes. People on line don't need to see me. Yes, they can still see. So the way I think we can do that to contribute to social justice issues by investigating linguistic practices and understanding linguistic practices and multilingual practices is through participatory linguistics. Something that I've been working on. The idea of participation in linguistics is not new. There are lots of people who've done it and doing it in different ways. There's in fact a large body of literature on participation in different kind of branches of linguistics, anthropological linguistics, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics. Citizen sociolinguistics is one of those. And also there is work on linguistics of participation itself, using language use as participation in social activities. Again, I'm not going to go through these literature here, and many of you here are very familiar. On that linguistics of participation, the argument there by other colleagues is viewing language use as participating in social activity and the cultural world, constructing and transmitting values, and moving the analytical focus from the production of codes, structures, and systems in the more conventional way of doing linguistics to the production and reproduction of social practices, values, subjectivities, and ideologies. So it is quite a different way of doing linguistics. We had a very interesting and really connected session yesterday in Second House, and Charles organized that on Decolonising Language Studies, and I did raise the slightly more provocative question whether linguistics, or the way we typically do it in the West, is in itself a colonial project. Well, let's not go there today. Participatory linguistics, as I do it, or I see it, or our group do it, is informed by interpretative phenomenological analysis, IPA, which came really out of health psychology. Basically, we see the linguists, the linguistic analyst's job is to try and make sense of the participants themselves, trying to make sense of their world. This what Jonathan Smith called the double hermeneutic. What we are doing we're observing the participants trying to make sense of their world in real life situations, as typical kind of ethnographic approach to language studies. But by trying to make sense of them, trying to make sense of their lives, we are participating in the social world, in their social world as well. So that is quite important point to make. Their world, their social world becomes part of ours, and ours becomes part of theirs. And what I try to suggest in my work in the past few years, and also in my writing, is we shouldn't, there's been a tendency, at least as far as I can see, in conventional linguistics, if you like, or especially formal linguistics, to try to make the observed facts or analysis objective. You know, try to distance that as if these are somehow, you know, objective facts. We mustn't, as far as I'm concerned, we mustn't pretend that we are presenting the so-called objective facts in our analysis. We're presenting our analysis, our understanding, situated understanding of what we have observed, which is necessarily subjective because we all come into our analysis from our own trajectories and background and ideologies as well. And we should not be afraid to say that. Actually, this is my understanding, this is my interpretation, and, you know, open it up to challenges as well. We as analysts have a responsibility to be open and explicit about our own social, cultural, political, ideological stance in presenting our interpretation and analysis, and invite the reader to participate in our analysis as a social act, analyzing observed phenomena in the way we do in the applied linguistics and applied social linguistics is a social act in itself. And it's that's my view. So doing linguistics therefore has social consequences. The way we do it, do linguistic analysis has social consequences. We're participating in a social act. Doing linguistics, we're participating in the social act through the way we represent the community. You know, we portray the community, their speakers, their languages, and the language practices in our analysis. The way we present it really have a social consequence. For that, we as analysts, you know, should remember that we give names to communicative practices in communities and call them these named languages. It was the linguists, not anybody else, who actually made up these names. But actually, you know, that has a social consequence clearly. But also, there are reasons why we use these names, and quite often these are names and labels for ethnic racial groups as well, or nation tags and names as well. We often categorize the speakers and users of different languages as first speaker, first language speaker, second language speaker, foreign language speaker, or users, and that again has serious social consequences. You know, once we label a group of speakers as foreign or second, or, you know, English as an additional language, because they have serious educational consequences in schools, definitely, but also other consequences. These names and categories carry specific social and political connotations beyond simple linguistic labels. And, you know, there are some theoretical arguments. I don't need to go into details. By describing someone as second language user of English, for example, has serious social implications for their identity, the expectations of their linguistic competence, and of course, educational implications as well. So many of you know I've been involved with lots of other colleagues in doing translanguaging research in the last 10 years or so. Translanguaging research is focused on bilingual, multilingual language users' linguistic practices, including language learning. We see the responsibility of our work, not simply as describing what is happening, which language is being used, to whom and when. These classic questions are obviously important, but also we see our responsibility as participating in a social debate over the value of multilingualism and over the consequences of communities coming together in an era of mobility and super diversity. And named languages are discrete. When the view that named languages are somehow discrete structural systems and entities is very much a Western view and possibly a colonial view from the perspective of translanguaging, because the naming of languages is a political act associated with colonialism and the idea and ideal of nation state. That is not a point that I'm making first. It's been discussed by many scholars over time as well. So the translanguaging idea, of course, is built on two very important premises. Named languages are political entities, and we need to take that quite seriously and ask different set of questions. And it's interesting that it's not, it's been talked about by many people, but it's not taken seriously through the research design and actual way of analyzing multiple practices. And of course, also the human mind and brain does not process named languages discretely and separately, as I said yesterday. The same neural networks and brain areas responsible for languages are responsible for all named languages, not like French lives in one place and Romanian lives in another in the brain. And this so-called modularity of mind could also be considered another essentially Western view of what human beings typically do. Just want to give you a very quick example. I won't have the time to show you the details of an example of so-called participatory linguistics in a translanguaging framework. It's a published piece of work and it's part of the original translating cultures project that Charles and Alison were both involved, and I still really remember. Well, we all have very fond memories of those years. Very exciting. The three teams. It's really good that the three teams are represented over here. It was a very exciting project that we were led by Chris. And ours was investigating linguistic and cultural transformation in super diverse wards in 4 UK cities. And for this bit of the work, we were focusing on London and different domains of what. For this particular example, we were following a London-based multilingual performance artist, originally from Poland, but she identifies herself in many different ways for different purposes on different occasions. And this is another reason why I'm moving towards the transpositioning idea in my more recent publications, that all originated from some of the observations there. She, as I say, is a performance artist. She writes these so-called scratch. Basically, they are kind of spontaneous play by involving lots of people. Her own work is very participatory and very engaged with the community and reflective on her own identity and experiences. She's particularly interested in Eastern European, and it's very interesting, her idea of this Eastern European concept, immigrants' experiences in London. And obviously lots of the writing is also based on her own experience and observations. So she's the main script writer, but in collaboration with others, including so British artists. And she's also the main actor in these plays. But once we started doing the project with her, basically we're interested in her experiences as an artist in London, multilingual artist. And we were initially primarily interested in her multilingual practices, very fluid multilingual practices. She does speak many different languages. She actually started to involve us. We got to know her because she came to attend some of the research seminars, and she was deeply interested in bilingualism, multilingualism. So it's not the other way around. We look out for her, but then we realize she's an artist. Oh, she's an interesting case to observe. So we became involved in that way. And then she decided to involve us in her writing, but also in her performance. So this is very multi-layered and deep kind of involved engagement and participation. So the frames of participation using that idea in different frames. Basically, one of our research associates who is also Polish multilingual, now a lecturer in Mary, and Zhuhua, my investigator, were observing M's work very closely, and they appear as part of the show, and the show actually has these observers in it, but they were on the stage doing the as part of the performance. So basically the show is about observing transformation, urban transformation in London through immigrants' eyes. And she's involved all these people, and me as a different kind of observer sitting in the audience, observing what's happening on stage, but also the audience participation in it. The show was very much participatory in that kind of sense, and all talking to each other and others, including the audience in the show. There's some pictures of how we were positioned and how some of our that's the actress herself and some of the other people, and including Agnieszka, I can't see where she is, but anyway, so Agnieszka was part of the play as an observer with camera. Actually, she was filming this and moving with the performance. And Zhuhua was part of the play also as an observer, sitting with a notebook, and I was recording the show in the audience. So there's multiple layers of participation. Now, this participation in this particular event, from the very beginning of writing the scratch to the actual performance, gained us much deeper understandings of this artist working and thinking beyond observing her multilingual practices. As I say, initially we were primarily interested in her multilingual practices, but actually really transcending these boundaries, linguistic boundaries, ethnic boundaries, national boundaries, professional boundaries, to her different roles, as well as the different modalities in her own practice, but also involving our own. There's a lot of self-reflection as well. We absolutely became part of M's professional and social world. As I said at the beginning, that's the spirit of participatory linguistics we do. We will become part of the participants' own social world. And we also changed. We really, once we reflected on these, and our field notes absolutely showed that very clearly, which discussed in our paper, our own views on migration, ethnic identities as well. That's why I said just now that it led to my reflection on the idea of transpositioning, moving around and going beyond the positionings that we bring into the world from our own kind of beginnings. So that's the kind of participatory linguistics work we do. Just to say a few more words about translanguaging in the education context, translanguaging pedagogy, and connecting that to what I'm going to say about the actual work we're doing in the IOE. want to start with by saying translanguaging pedagogy is not the same as pedagogical translanguaging, and we really want to make that very clear, because there is a lot of discussion and there are books on pedagogical translanguaging, it's a type of translanguaging practice in the classroom as if it's a teaching method. It was never meant to be a teaching method. But in any case, the idea of translanguaging pedagogy is to induce or trigger translanguaging shifts, or these transpositioning through co-learning, and also to enhance sociolinguistic sensitivities by engaging, participating with the social and sociolinguistic realities of the community and the learner's background. So it's very much a philosophy, a pedagogical philosophy regarding the education of minoritized and racialized language learners and others, not necessarily intended as a language teaching pedagogy. We've got no problem if people want to implement it as a pedagogical practice, but just want to be very clear that's what we're doing. So shifts to translanguaging stance means not simply about allowing different languages to be used in the classroom, and it's not meant to be additive, but reconstitutive, really challenging the language status, language ideologies, and ultimately the power relations in the learning environment in schools and classrooms. I won't say too much about co-learning. This is more Edward Brandmeier's work that we use of, and that's where we can induce these language translanguaging shifts. To do that, we need co-learning, basically resetting the power relations within the classroom, within the learning environment, and see the instructor, the teacher, and learner as co-learners, shared power amongst co-learners, social, individualized learning. These are characteristics of co-learning, collective and individual meaning making and identity exploration, community practice, situative learning, and real-world engagement and action. And the translanguaging stance we want to move towards is really a perspective that views bilingual, multilingual language learners or learners, linguistic practices and their racial ethnic identities together. It's that integrated togetherness that we want to emphasize, as well as the sociolinguistic realities of the community and the educational demands of the classroom and school together. And achieving transpositioning, where participants break from their preset and prescribed roles and switch perspectives with others through translanguaging and transmodal communication, and through co-learning by releasing oneself from the conventions and fostering a greater sense of possibilities. That's the idea of transposition. So again, there are some publications that outlines some of these ideas in some more detail. Just to say a few words to conclude about what we're doing in the IOE, and also through the newly set up National Consortium for Languages Education. So we've done quite a lot of work. There is a decolonizing decolonizing the language curriculum network through ALL, Association for Language Learning, and very much initiated by my colleagues in the Montfort Language PGCE group in the IOE. So we've got resources in different languages on having conversation about race, which is not quite in the curriculum, about Islamic influence on language and culture, again, quite sensitive issues there, but we want to bring that into the discussion, into the curriculum. Historical figures, some are very controversial, colonial figures, but we feel it's really important to talk about them, especially when we're talking about many of these major colonial languages from Europe. European Day of Languages, every year we want to make sure that the discussions have elements about colonialism, coloniality, and all that in the discussion as well. We also talk about climate change. We use some specific cases about female painters. There's a very interesting piece of work going on, and lots of other really interesting work on endangered language and language context cases as well. And we also have a number of specific events and initiatives to embrace a multilingual and intercultural outlook in language and general and cultural language teaching and learning. And focus very much on creativity and culture throughout our program, and inclusivity underpins all of that. So some of these work may look like, focus very much on traditional elements like vocabulary and grammar, but actually goes way beyond that. So we've had special events on teaching for anti-racism through language teaching. We feature language teaching in the Black History Month, and also, IOE is very famous for Holocaust education. It's got a big, huge center, was also huge impact on national curriculum. And we want to make sure that multilingualism is featured there and so connected in that particular context. And this is an example, another initiative led by some of our colleagues, but through other platforms as well. And I also just want to point out that the newly established National Consortium for Languages Education, the DFE funded Languages Hub program, which builds on the very successful Mandarin Excellence program, has this home, heritage, and community languages dimension to it. It doesn't have ring-fenced funding, but we are going to make sure that the lead hub schools that are going to be funded through our consortium will feature HHCLs very prominently, and that's we've had great support from some of the communities. We had a Polish embassy yesterday, really wanting to be involved in promoting their languages. We will critique and challenge some of these labels as well as part of our work, but fundamentally we want to create a space for debate about community language education in the school and bring them into the school system. I want to just conclude by making some remarks on university as a translanguaging space. Again, this was discussed yesterday at yesterday's event. There is an implicit medium of instruction policy. I don't think it's a policy as such, although some universities do seem to have a policy. It is English, and there is a standard academic or academic English standard expected of all our students, whatever the background may be. There is very little discussion about the language of learning, exactly what language people actually learn in, or should we think about the medium of learning in different ways, because we are dealing with highly multilingual learners in British universities these days. And students learning through their own languages. There are lots of information available to them in different languages. We tend not to pay any attention to the source of the information they get, or what language they are actually doing the learning in outside the lecture theatre. How do we incorporate that knowledge that is gained through different languages and different cultural contexts, of course, into the teaching and learning in the university is a big question that we are discussing in the IOE. I was going to put the IOE building there last night, thinking actually that picture, that image is rather brutal. This probably doesn't fit the theme of today's discussion very well. So I'm going to leave it there. Basically, in the IOE, we're trying to critique academic language and academic English as a colonial construct. We have some colleagues really interested in critiquing EMI, English Medium Instruction, as a colonial construct. And also there is a lot of research. We have some wonderful colleagues working on so-called unequal Englishes, really moving the agenda for on world Englishes and English lingua franca's work there. Very, very critical sociolinguistic and critical applied linguistics work there. These are just some of the examples of the work we do, but we clearly want to connect with colleagues here and beyond, advancing that work for higher education in the UK. I think that's going to be a very important part of the agenda. So achieving transformation, very last one, and transpositioning through multiple and complex participation with colleagues and collaborations from diverse linguistic and cultural background and trajectories is the only way forward in this collaborative work that we're all doing, trying to decolonize language studies and language education in higher education, in schools, and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Relay. And our next speaker is Professor Alison Phipps from the University of Glasgow, who's arrived from Canada today, this morning. So presentation is there.
I'll use what I need when I need it. Thank you.
And save your questions for after the break. Thank you.
Yes, or if you are following online, you can also talk about the chat box.
Yes.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. First of all, thank you for bearing with me, for not knowing which Institute of Advanced Studies I was going to go to, and wondering why I couldn't find Charles's event, which was on yesterday, and nobody else could find room G12 either. So it was an interesting few moments, but thank you also to Jelena and Esther for inviting me along and bearing with my travel plans. I am literally just off a flight from Toronto, so the room is spinning and my ears are doing that thing, you know, that thing that they do. So if I'm too loud, tell me to go down a bit, and if I'm too soft, just tell me to come up a bit. So I have a few slides, but they're kind of more wallpaper, because really I want to respond to the excellent questions that I think you're asking in the development of this second symposium, and really think about participatory approaches that I've used in community settings throughout the whole of my academic career, and that is now a good 30 years. I'm going to start in the middle because, as Rowan Williams says, thought always begins in the middle of the mess. We never really have a beginning We're usually in the middle of the mess, and that's what we've got to make sense of. And something's happening to us that means we have to make sense of it. So I'm going to jump around a little bit chronologically, but I want to start off by saying this. Titero, correro, pacarongo. That is an approach to participatory language teaching in the community setting that is Te Reo Māori. Now, I was appointed as a visiting professor for a while at a number of different universities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as part of that work, I arrived at a desk and there was a piece of paper on my desk. And the piece of paper said, please sign this. And what it said on the piece of paper was, the undersigned will abide by the Treaty of Waitangi, o Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So I thought I better kind of make sure I know what I'm signing here. So of course, for those of you who don't know, the treaty is a highly problematic translational document. What it says in Te Reo Māori is not the same as what it says in English. The decisions and the ways in which it's been implemented have been violent, colonial, and have involved ethnic cleansing on the part of the Crown, that's us, and in the context of the white settler Pākehā community. And with regards to the Māori, have meant increasing marginalisation, increasing movement away from lands, but also a great deal of resistance, including the New Zealand Wars, where eventually settlement was arrived at. So having picked up this piece of paper, I thought, what am I going to do to uphold the Treaty of Waitangi for the short period of time that I was going to be in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So I wrote out to some of my Pākehā and some of my Māori friends and said, guys, what do I do? And they said, you learn Te Reo Māori our way, which means completely decreating all the ways in which I have ever learned or taught a language. It means not using literacy methods at all. It means not having any basis to a kind of recourse to grammar or dictionaries, which is, of course, how I was taught, using the grammar translation method back in the day. It means not really doing lots of repetition. It's not really an audiolingual method. It's not really a communicative competence method. It didn't fit into any of the approaches that I was used to. What it was highly participatory. Titero, korero, whakarongo are the ways in which participation in the learning of a language take place. Titero means to listen. And much of what you are expected to do, particularly as a Pākehā, which literally translates as a person who has come from a fort far away. It's often translated as a fair-skinned person, but it's somebody who's come from a different part, a different place, a different dwelling. But what you are asked to do is to listen first. That's part of the tradition of greeting, the porphyry. Korero is then to speak. Korero. And when we begin the learning of Te Reo Māori, we use gestures like this alongside the words. So you don't learn titero and say titero, you learn titero and say titero. You don't learn korero and say korero, you learn korero and say korero. So it's almost linking in with what my best reference was with sign language, for example. And whakarongo means to move and feel it in your body. To literally, in the dictionary, the Te Reo dictionary, it means to prance about, a term used for the dramatic way a challenger might advance on a marae with quick, abrupt, jumping movements. Now, I'm starting there because actually it really refers to my experience of participation in language learning and language research in communities. So I undertook my doctoral research in theatre. The reason why I did that was because age 15 I got lost. I got lost hiking on the Schwäbische Alb, and we were meant to be going to an open air community theatre performance in Swabian dialect in Germany that evening. And because we got lost, we didn't. We had a great night around a campfire, but I was always kind of nagged by the fact that this wonderful form of community theatre that people spent a lot of time putting on in a dialect, not in Hochdeutsch, not in the kind of High German, was something I'd missed. And so through my studies, this kept nagging at me. I tried to do my dissertation on it, and for various reasons that didn't quite work out. So I ended up writing about Walter von der Vogelweide instead. And I came to my PhD, and my PhD was then on open air community theatre and Naturtheater in southern Germany. And I decided that I would experiment with a methodology that hadn't been used in German studies before, which was participatory, community-based ethnography and theatre and performance ethnography. And that meant going to live in the communities that performed the plays and joining in and asking if I might even have a role in those performances. Now, this was happening at the point in time when anthropology came home. Jackson wrote a brilliant book back in the day called Anthropology at Home, and this was published around about the time, very conveniently, that I was looking for a reference to allow me to do anthropology at home, i.e. within a European setting, and not to do the orientalizing work, which at that point in time, anthropology was in the middle of deconstructing. So the big texts of people like Clifford Geertz, James Clifford, they were all at that time really doing decolonizing of anthropology, and that was in the early 1990s. In many ways, anthropology is a long way down the road and a lot further on than we are within language disciplines in terms of trying to think about what positionality means, where we stand, why we stand there, what the ethics are of doing what we do, how we might leave the field. In fact, all of these fantastic questions that you've written out here. So I found myself in the middle of the Schwäbische Alb for 3 months over the course of 2 years. And in the meantime, through the winters, the performances, the rehearsals, the many different elements of deciding on costuming and set building and clearing up forests, and doing all of this, not in Hochdeutsch, but in the Swabian dialect. So ich kann auch ein bisschen Schwäbisch schwätzen, for those of you who know what that means. I'm working on transposing and translating texts like A Midsummer Night's Dream, not into German or not using the German translation, but transposing them into the Swabian dialects. And not just into any old Swabian dialect, but the one that was spoken in Rheinland, which is the one from the Alb, wo es immer ein bisschen kälter ist, where it's always 1 coat colder than it might be down in the Neckar Valley, in the big metropolis of Stuttgart. So yeah, performing on a stage, wearing an implausibly tightly laced, bone corseted velvet dress that had been chosen for me as part of the ethics that I was putting in place by the community of actors around me, who said, you want to really experience performance? You want to really know what it's like? Well, we're putting you into this costume. And every single week as they laced me into the bone corset, I would have a very clear understanding of whether or not I'd eaten too much spaghetti that week or not. Performing in a dialect of a language that you've learned as a school student, which is how I'd learned German, led me to really reflecting on how we teach and learn and participate in the lives of people when we are teaching undergraduate students. Because I realized that through performance, through that added adrenaline of the bone corseted gown and standing on stage, but also the support and participation of my acting colleagues, that not only was my German and my Swabian dialect improving dramatically, but also my embodiment of the language, my sense of how it would sit in my diaphragm to project to 2,000 people on stage, or in other parts of my body as I carried myself in a language and a dialect would change. This also led to all kinds of different understandings of participation, and also this difficult phrase that is used and is now deconstructed in anthropology, to go native. So what does it mean to go native when you're not a native speaker? These were questions I was asking back in the 1990s, because those were categories, hugely problematic categories, categories that easily decolonized and deconstructed for ourselves now, but also important, because what I was discovering when I was actually acting on stage is that much of what is written in the participatory handbooks on ethnographic research methods is that distance between yourself and the field that would actually dissolve in those moments of performance, because you weren't authentically who you were, but you were authentically who you now were acting. And that these role plays took me obviously into lots of work by people like Goffman, also into the work of Victor Turner and Richard Schechner, also into the work of Karen Barber from her anthropology in Nigeria, and into the work of Naomi Conn-Liebler. So some really interesting theatre practitioners, community theatre practitioners, and into the work of Auguste Boal and his theatre of the oppressed, trying to really understand through workshopping what happens if you start with whakarongo, if you get people to stand up and model and act out and show the shape of something that was hurting them or blinding them or that they couldn't hear or they didn't want to know, and what you could do with your body to transpose and speak and enable a language. So that was where I started out. Obviously, then when I got a job, I really wanted to teach like this because it was great. It was really good fun. And one of the things it did for me, but also I noticed for my students back in the mid to late 1990s, it took the fear away. It took the shame away. It meant that people were not focusing on which words they were getting wrong in a communicative language learning class. It meant people were focusing on doing things, that there was a third term that was more important if we were acting or producing plays, that the memorization work was shifting us away from, oh no, I might get picked on, and that 2 minutes I've got to speak the language in a communicative learning class absolutely disappeared. And we ended up in a place where between ourselves, we were helping with cues. So when people were putting on their little playlets or skits or sketches or the German play, as we did every year, or translanguaging a play, as we did back in 1999 with my colleague Meg Mumford, using Brechtian techniques, we basically put the English translation and the German translation of a play together, brought in a fabulous set designer, and we put on the unbelievably weird play Fegefeuer in Ingolstadt, Purgatory in Ingolstadt. None of us really understood what the play was about, but my goodness was it exciting to stage, because it's a play about young people getting high on violence and bullying. And we were then casting this. We were casting it with accent, with body shape, with form, with theatre of the oppressed. We were doing it in English and in German together, with a theatre class and a German class. We were putting people up. We would never be allowed to do this now. The risk assessment wouldn't allow us, but we were putting people up 15 feet high on a scaffold where they had with a carabiner to clip on and clip off and climb up and down and literally get high, and they experienced what it meant to be high in a body whilst they were being high on alcohol in a play. All of these things gave people a much expanded sense of what it meant to participate, but to do it through performance and through theatre. So Li Wei, thank you for your wonderful talk just before here, because it's just beautifully set up what I want to talk about. So whakarongo has become something I've discovered later in life as almost an approach to, I wouldn't say teaching and learning language, I would say performing the language, understanding language learning as a performance of everyday life, as Goffman would have it, but also potentially a really exciting festive performance that's a culmination of many things. So in my teaching through the 90s and into the 2000s, I used these approaches very much in my teaching of German. So I had two courses. One was called Popular German Culture, and another one was called The Greening of Germany. I mean, both courses, everybody knew at the start they were going to have to stage the course at the end in German. So everything they were learning about the topic of popular German culture, which led us into looking at Marxist theories and feminist theories of all kinds of different forms of popular genres of film and literature, they would need to become characters from those novels or from those films and act them out, alongside a critique of the class. So they were needing to position themselves multiply through performance. So all of their notes in class, I discovered later, had a line down the middle. And on the one side it said, these are the weird things Alison's doing, or she's teaching us. And on the other side, there were their theoretical notes and their language notes and their language learning notes. And at the end, they would put on a play. Now, they usually did it, I don't even know if this is still on telly, using the genre of blind date. So that kind of dating game. And they would pick characters that they'd been reading. Walter Benjamin, there he was, or Jacques Derrida would turn up and they would raid all the charity shops on Byers Road. That's the road like your streets here by the University of Glasgow, and they would dress up and then they would come and perform. Now, what I discovered they were doing through that, performing in the language with the theoretical concepts, dressing up, wearing the lipstick, putting the hair up, all that adrenaline, it meant that they were taking it really seriously. They were wrapping it around, they were clothing their studies, they were caring for them in a way we rarely ask our students to care for their study. It wasn't just clothing it with paper, it was a much wider human sense of the work. And after a while, the external examiners suggested that we actually did a bit of a study on these students and the courses because they were getting such good marks. And because in their oral exams, which of course the external examiners did, all they could talk about were these fun things that they were doing with their acting and performance, and they would start to act some of those things out. So it was highly motivatory, it was great fun, it led to really good repetition, regular rehearsal, that what Schechner calls the increasing of strips of behaviour, and it was participatory. The whole class shared it. They really felt it was their work overall. So time passes and the Vice-Chancellor restructures the university. So I find myself for a little while in anthropology and then in another little while in English language teaching, and then eventually where I am now in the School of Education. And I'm beginning at that point to move my work alongside my participation as a real person as opposed to an academic. So obviously academia is where I perform and my real life is elsewhere. And I started to volunteer by visiting the detention centre of Dungavel, where people are housed for deportation, an immigration removal centre. And I went because Shirley Williams, some of you who are old may remember that Shirley Williams was a politician, and Shirley Williams went on the radio and the late great Shirley Williams, and said, I need linguists. And I thought, I'm a linguist, I've got lots of languages. And she said, we need linguists to go and visit people in detention because they need to be able to rest a little and speak a language other than English, because English is the language in which they're going to be deported and in which all their interviews for their asylum interviews are taking place. So utterly naively, I went up to Dungavel Removal Centre and discovered that even though I was a professor of languages, so a professional linguist, my languages were useless. I was way too fluent in way too many colonial languages and European languages, produced because of the Entente Cordiale that said we needed to learn French and German to stop there being wars again. And I had taken that seriously. And here I was sitting in front of people who spoke Pashto and Tigrinya, who spoke Arabic, who maybe spoke a little French, but usually had other languages like Ewe and Ga and Shona and Twi. And I was completely useless for that purpose that Shirley Williams had falsely recruited me for. However, the participatory training and the ethnographic training that I'd done was really helpful, because one of the things I'd learned about ethnography and language learning and performance, those three things almost layered, is that all of them require you to make a fool of yourself. All of them require you to know nothing. All of them require you to make many, many, many mistakes. A central concept in ethnography is naivety. The ethnographic naivety that you do not know, you are not an expert. that you decenter yourself, that you center the understanding and the knowledges of the communities that you are with, and that is a fundamental decolonizing move, decentering move, and a decreating move. It's a move that's vital to interculturality. We are required to decenter ourselves in any intercultural framework to be able to understand from the perspective of others. And so I realized that this decentering might also be useful in the removal center. So the hour and a half that I used to spend with the world's most undrinkable coffee, courtesy of G4S and Serco in the removal centres, turned into language classes, where the young guys would teach me to speak their languages. And they would be helpless with laughter, because here was a professor of languages who didn't even know their language existed. And in that moment, there was an equalizing, only for 90 minutes, and only courtesy of this dreadful coffee. But in that moment, the dignity of language was restored to a group of people utterly stripped of their dignity in those contexts. And they were laughing at me, and I was the learner, and I was stumbling, and I couldn't pronounce it, and my tonalities were saying all kinds of obscene things. And I was learning the language of football because that's what people wanted to talk about. All of that really meant I changed my life and the direction of my studies. So whilst I've always researched things that move, people that move, work that moves, be it affectively, moving your emotion, being it dramatically, moving an audience, be it looking at learners on their year abroad or tourists moving, I began to really focus in on people seeking asylum and people with a refugee background. And largely that's what I now do, and that's what my work as UNESCO chair is looking at. It's looking at refugee integration through languages and the arts, and using ethnographic, participatory, community-based methods to do it. I wrote books on this right back in the day. There was a book in 2004 I did with the wonderful Mike Gonzalez, my dear friend, where we talked about ethnography and language learning, really building on some wonderful projects that have been done by people like Celia Roberts and Mike Byram and Shirley Jordan and John O'Regan. I know other areas that were beginning to do this work in language learning. And what goes around comes around. And here we have those questions again. And they're like looking at the questions from 20 years ago that we were asking, only they're better, because they're bringing in that decolonial element really explicitly. How am I doing for time? 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
You're okay? You're all right? You still with me? Great. So through that work and that experience in the removal centres, I began to think about the ways in which I positioned myself as a language expert. So that move that I'd made in the detention centre, but also how I was being positioned by my field as a language expert, because everyone seemed to want me to come and talk about language learning and linguistic competence or intercultural communicative competence, and everything was terribly competent. All will be competent, indeed they will. And I was increasingly troubled by this. So I wrote an article back in, I don't know, 2013, maybe 2012 on linguistic incompetence, which came from being asked to be an advisor on a project looking at researching multilingually. And I wrote my I am a competent linguist piece, and I told the story about being competent in many languages and having studied them, and therefore being very good at researching in other languages, and all the ways in which this had helped me. And then I stopped and I thought, but this is actually not true any longer. And actually the languages that I require a competency in are not available to me. They're not provided for by the state, and they're not even visible within our school system. And when I was growing up, the fact that the languages in the school were largely Urdu and Punjabi was irrelevant. We had to learn French, German, and maybe Russian if we were smart, because it was the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire at that point in time. So I was really keen to start to tell a different story about my own incompetence in that context. And then as I began to do more research, both in low to middle income countries and in this country, with people who were the most marginalized, who were pushed out to the edge, who were not provided for by our language curricula, whose work is happening in the kinds of places that particularly Angela, Chris and Adrian have looked at, those schools that take place in the mosques, in the Saturday schools, in the community centres. You know, the kind of community centres, one where the condensation runs down the wall and everyone's wearing 6 layers and a hat, and somebody's brought in some soup on a Saturday morning to keep a language alive, to do that intangible cultural heritage. Those participatory approaches were the places where I would find myself the most. But I was really interested in what incompetence might show us. And this was particularly manifest when I was doing research ethnographically on lifelong learning in the Gaza Strip in 2013. And during that time, we were bombed. Not as badly as the bombing is happening there, but we had to be evacuated. And of course, I was in a position where I didn't understand anything because I didn't have Arabic. So I didn't know what people were saying other than la 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 and yalla yalla yalla. That was about as far as I could go. And I realized at that point how much I was nonetheless understanding and how much care was being taken by that Bakarongo practice of prancing about and moving and pushing and moving people into various positions and eventually evacuating us from the strip. So all of this has led me to a project of decolonising multilingualism, which is about thinking more widely than the curriculum, thinking within the contexts of our learning and starting largely with the inarticulate body. So in the very short book that I had great fun writing called Decolonising Multilingualism, Struggles to Decreate, there's a little manifesto in there, which is the beginning of a conversation really with people. But I wanted to look at what happens when the body cannot articulate itself, when we are unable to say or understand things, and how we might understand language and language learning there, when we might be in pain, when, as Elaine Scarry has said, and it's one of my favourite quotes, as Charles knows, when the body is in pain, then we are unable to articulate ourselves. We are rendered inarticulate. We are reduced to screams. If that, we require others to speak on our behalf, to help us through. We become, as Clifford Getz puts it, almost a super organism as we connect into others who might be helping us. And I wrote there about the experience of the greatest physical pain I've ever had in my life, which I had when I accidentally fell down a storm drain in Ghana when I was due to be directing this particular performance in the Dangbe rainforest with a group of dancers in about 20 different languages, and where we would not be using English. But I hadn't really realized how much pain I would be in and how little language I would be capable of speaking. But in that moment, I was able to be placed in a context where work was undertaken on my body as a dance therapy, using massage and manipulation. That meant that I was in too much pain to be able to speak, and others were speaking and languaging my body for me. And that was one of the areas that I became really interested in the ways in which that is an intrinsic part of our language learning. And that in Te Reo Māori, in the way that people teach, the listen, the speak, and the whakarongo, that whakarongo element is a really key part to participation. Us not being in a place of power, us being rendered mute, us being in a place of our own pain and vulnerability is a key element in enabling participatory work to be equitable, or to find a different balance, or to enable others to be in a position where that can work. I also looked at the way in which we might decolonize the heart, and I looked at the way within my own family, a refugee family, I was unable to understand a lot of the language spoken that was critical to bringing a family together again, but actually was regularly enabled into language, gradually, slowly and performatively, by being clothed in a zuria, and by being brought into, as an Eritrean mother, the practice of making coffee the coffee ceremony that I, as an Eritrean mother, have to be competent in, so that my competence in a particularly set of ceremonial actions then required linguistic actions to go with them. And that was very like those experiences in theatre that I've been having, so that I can now speak of the Jebene, the Zoria, the Funchal, the Mashrafa, and I can understand where those words have come from and why they're useful and necessary in a ceremony. And then finally, the work of decolonising the mind through this process of learning Te Reo Māori, not well, but well enough to be able to do the protocols, the pepeha and the mihi, the protocols of the work that I'm doing. And that those protocols would allow me to be in a place where we would meet each other, greet each other, and be able to eat with each other in ways which were restorative of relationships, that were post-decolonial, where it was clear that what had happened was not a critique of our colonial methods, but the attempt by one human being to have a go, to render themselves vulnerable, to laugh at themselves and be laughed at, to stumble through that pronunciation, and to be in a place where a new set of relationships might be made, and made collectively, because no one, there isn't a word I speak that I haven't been given by other people. And if I expand that to the context of language learning and language education, then that, my friends, is how I believe we need to open out, break out into the world of the body, of affect, of pain, of tears, but also of joy, and find out what might be found when we improvise and make things together. So all the work we do in the UNESCO chair, and I'll finish here, thank you for the time mark, Helena. All of the work we do within the UNESCO chair it's collective. It isn't so much a chair as a set of cushions on the floor. We made cushions together to demonstrate that. And it's very much about saying it's our task, if we're going to do work with people who are trying to receive new people into their midst, and people who are arriving, coming from contexts of pain and pressure, that we need to do this in ways which are restorative of dignity, that are fun, and that will allow us collectively to hold that bowl of tears in ways which are safe and ethical, and expand a space for joy. So now, when I'm undertaking participatory method, one of the key questions I ask is, what will be good for all of us to be doing? So that's not about extracting data, mining it, cleansing it, all those terrible words we use about data, which really belie the extractivist contexts that have led to the Anthropocene, but they're permacultural. They're about saying we are part of an ecotome as human beings that are participating in a much wider set of ecologies, repertoires, that many of which have also been formed by and mimic the language of birds or trees or the sound of an echo of a rock, and that those are the spaces of our exploration, and those are now the spaces of our making and our performance. So this performance here, very much one where that kind of work, and it's quite similar to what Liwei was speaking about, was going on. That's enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. I couldn't write a word of what you said. I'm so moved. Our next speaker, Victoria Denis. So yeah, without further ado.
Hi everyone, and thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Esther and Yelena for the invitation, the very generous invitation to speak today. I'm going to talk about a research project and my institutional role as an applied linguist within a creative arts university. So there are a few of us, there are a few linguists about, but they're relatively well hidden. I started work at the University of the Arts, again, a specialist university, a post-1992 university in London, which has a college-based system, and the colleges have distinct identities, traditions and histories of their own, which I think has implications for putting strategies and policies into practice at an institutional level. I joined as a postdoctoral researcher 6 weeks before lockdown in January, February 2020. And my brief was to conduct an institutional research project, which was called Reimagining Conversations with Students with English as an Additional Language. Institutionally, that was reduced to the acronym of SSEES, which again was problematic. The brief was to explore and investigate the creative and educational potential of international students, specifically at the institution, because then and now what was then EU students and international students made up 55% of the university body, and I think that's perhaps quite common across UK higher education. Again, my brief was to conduct qualitative exploratory research with the end goal, the outcome was to create an environment where the institution as a whole, across the different colleges, which are made up of fashion, fine art, design, and so on, where the institution as a whole could carry out a critical institutional reflection on the practices which may unwittingly affect the educational outcomes and contribute to persistent awarding gaps between home and international students, Black students and students of colour, and students who identify as white, and so on. So today I'd like to talk about my experience of the research project. I conducted research which was exploratory and participatory, drawing on linguistic ethnographic tradition. So I conducted over a year field work which involved online and in-person observations, but also retrospective interviews, and that's what I'd like to talk about. Currently, my role, I'm based in a part of the university called the Decolonising Arts Institute, and the aim of the institute, which is to challenge colonial and imperial legacies, disrupting ways of seeing, listening, thinking, and making in order to drive social, cultural, and institutional change. So although the Institute as a whole engages in funded external projects in the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, my role is focusing on the institution. From there, sorry. That's or I could do it. That's fine. So as I've said, I was a newcomer, an outsider, a linguist within an institution that privileges the visual and the creative arts. I entered into the field drawing on ethnographic traditions based on Himes and others on ethnographic monitoring, where I tried to understand the environment that I'd entered, the context, and so on. And I would like to perhaps show two examples of the participatory techniques and approaches, and perhaps what the consequences are for language, but perhaps unlike some of the previous comments, language in education. So I became friendly with a fine artist that ran the graduate postgraduate program in fine art called Katrina Held, who was Norwegian, and she was very interested in what's known as crits, art and design crits. They're presented as democratic open spaces where in a room not dissimilar to this one, students who are preparing artwork, it can be painterly practice, it can be sculptures and so on, or other forms of installations. They display their work, and then the crit is a way in which they would enable students or all students to receive feedback on their own practice. Crits are in the literature are presented as relatively non-hierarchical, flat. They're presented drawing on the Bauhaus movement, sometimes as being silent, where it's as important to listen as it is to speak and engage and ask questions. At the same time, there's been a lot of work on decolonizing the crit, creating safer crit spaces. So already there's a kind of a tensions between the crits as open and democratic and perhaps the lived experiences of these spaces. So Katrina Held one day said, Victoria, we're having a crit in Peckham. You're welcome to come. And I thought this was a wonderful opportunity as an institutional researcher within the university to really understand what some of the challenges and opportunities not only for international students, but for all students and indeed tutors to engage in. I was given an address, and the address was in Peckham, which some of you will know is a part of London that is undergoing gentrification, although it's not complete. So it's a really interesting space. I remember as an undergraduate in the late 80s, I lived in Peckham before gentrification. So the crit itself, the tutor Katrina set up the day. It was over the crit was over 2 days where students present and talked about their work. And there were two visiting, again, international multilingual art tutors who were conducting the crit. I was there in the safe house, which you can see felt very incredibly unsafe to me. It was safe in the sense that it used to be a safe house for protecting informants, criminals, other people. But it was, you can just see that there's some artwork presented. The safe house had electricity, but there wasn't any plumbing. There weren't any seats. So already you can see that over a sort of a full day of crits, you need a certain amount of stamina. It wasn't really ethically appropriate or indeed possible for me to record interaction and the conversation. So I took field notes. And again, I've highlighted this example of some of the conversations that took place between, in this case, it was two tutors amongst themselves talking about a student who had created an oil painting. This was work in progress. And I scribbled down what I heard. So the first tutor said, have you thought about working much bigger? I think you would really benefit from working bigger. And then continues later on. I find the size of the painting really limiting. This is in front of peers of about 30 students. The second tutor present in the safe house, I actually disagree with the first tutor. I'm really interested in colour. It felt quite juvenile to me. So we can see that there's a disconnect between these spaces of open, democratic, supportive peer review, where the tutor drawing on the Bauhaus tradition holds back, and what actually happens during interaction. So this was one example of how I felt that there was, in terms of institutional discourses, why some students may have found this space particularly challenging. I'd now like to move on to an online observation. So this was a fine art crit. Second example, relates to design, a postgraduate group of design students at Central St. Martin's, one of the more, or perhaps it's debatable, but one of the more privileged and certainly institutions at the university. So in this example, I'm observing online and the students are presenting their work online. Is it possible to show the clip? Yes. And this is also another crit. It's a design crit, but takes place online. So this student, an international student, is showing her art practice, again, in order to receive feedback from her peers. So I'll just play a video of that. It's relatively short. Yes. You have to look.
Think you need to go to the presentation outside Zoom. If there is a presentation open outside.
No, it's a premiere.
I think we are really running behind schedule.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
We'll be lovely to watch that maybe
Okay.
in the discussion. And to be honest, I think your quotations there are quite,
Okay.
you know, quite
All right.
engaging.
All right, I'll just
Let's just talk
Sure,
about
sure.
that. We have to keep up there.
So the student Angela presents her work online, and you can see from the screenshot that she's drawing on multimodal resources. Angela is an international student based in Canada. She's English dominant, but also speaks Cantonese. And she chooses to draw on her multilingual resources as a way of developing her art practice. I was then lucky enough to interview the student, and she explains that she talks about some of the challenges it is of, although for her she's drawing on her multilingual resources for her art practice, she talks about how challenging it was. And she says, in terms of my upbringing, so she's not a language learner, she's not a linguistic student, she's a design student. In terms of my upbringing, code switching is a lot to do with colonization, immigrants, just like a whole bunch of topics. It's political. She then talks about, perhaps skip a little bit, but she then talks about her experiences of trying to explain what she's doing, her positionality and identity as an international student of colour, a multilingual speaker, to her monolingual tutors, who again are specialists in their field. And she says, when I'm showing my work in crit spaces to my tutor who's British and who I think is monolingual, he kept asking me, oh, why did you say it like this? Why is it like that? And I kept, or kind of having to keep explain a lot. While if someone who is multilingual knew the same languages as me and watched my videos, they were like, oh yeah, I totally understand that it's relatable. She then later on says there's a lot of hand-holding in terms of explaining it to tutors, so they will understand where I'm coming from because they don't understand her. So I think what she's suggesting is that in terms of the responsibility for using languages other than standard English in a dominant Anglophone university, Even though in a visual arts and creative space where students are routinely encouraged to draw on multiple semiotic resources, text, colour, fonts, and so on, layout, orthography, to develop their creative work, the responsibility seems to be on the individual. And this is quite troubling for Angela. I think this example in particular also raises issues around assessment, and if we are to encourage the opportunities for drawing on individuals' repertoire in order to descend to particular kinds of language practices as well as art practices, there's an issue around what is assessed. If I've been able to play the clip, you would have heard Angela having a dialogue with her mother, and they are really translanguaging between what I suppose is standard Canadian English and Cantonese. So they're having this conversation, but the question is, if the tutor doesn't understand Cantonese, how can this work be assessed according to perhaps relatively abstract assessment criteria, which is used to assess other forms of communicative practices? So that was the second. That was the second example. In line with an institutional project and an institutional report of this kind, I drew up a number of recommendations that were based on findings. The findings were mainly based on classroom interaction, particularly in digital classrooms, resources to support staff for supporting students drawing on their multilingual practices, particularly for language in education when the specialist tutors were non-language specialists, or perhaps didn't have an interest in language specifically. They were fine artists, designers, and so on. And also specifically awareness raising around languages, language use, and the use of and development and understanding of named languages within the academy, within the Arts Academy. This didn't seem particularly controversial to me. However, on completing the report and publishing the report, it was suggested that I needed to pause dissemination. And there were reasons for that. And it seems to me that part of the Decolonising the curriculum and part of the Decolonising the University project is around navigating and negotiating these difficult spaces, moving into spaces that perhaps as a linguist, perhaps I didn't belong, or perhaps I'd misunderstood, or was making recommendations that were perhaps unwittingly problematic or contentious. And what I'd like to do is perhaps talk, as we're over time, is talk about some of the issues that have emerged. So in terms of the institutional response to the report and the recommendations around use of multiple languages in art and design classrooms, what seemed to be happening was sort of forms of institutionalized resistance. Cornell notes that academia is riddled with an uneven distribution of knowledge production, and Monica Heller and Martins also remind us that resistance reveals universities to be sites of struggle and inequity, a place of cultural reproduction, a discursive space in which different groups up and down the institutional hierarchy tussle for access to symbolic and material resources that privilege some and marginalize others. So some of the responses were that, you can't see the top one, was that the first one, the categories seemed to me that the resistance related to the institution's legal position in terms of the use of other languages in the classroom, particularly for assessment, even though we're talking about art, we're talking about the assessment of making, the assessment of making practices. One comment was that the recommendations of the report may not have fully aligned with the Office for Students, and or university policy and practices. And I found for a short time that I was having meetings with the assistant director of X for legal and external relations. This felt quite heavy. I was an early career researcher at the time. I also think that there are, universities, as are other institutions, are constantly changing. You know, Alison sort of spoke about that, changing departments, changing the dynamics. Two senior management figures had recently left. So I think the institution was saying, this is great, it's been peer reviewed and so on, but not now. Our staff may become confused. And I think that confusion related to an opportunity and reasons for pausing the dissemination of the report, but also I think a sense that what I was saying around decoloniality of language and the English as a colonial artifact and Anglo-normative practices within the institution somehow jarred with other priorities, climate justice, sustainable fashion, anti-racism, all crucial causes. But I would suggest that students' language backgrounds and repertoires are potentially a way of cutting across these institutional categories and labels. So we no longer speak about international students and home students, we can talk about repertoires of use, semiotic resources for meaning making. Because I was speaking, perhaps critiquing the university and many universities' internationalization strategies, which certainly what I've observed relates to more students more frequently, and I'm recommendations around certainly drawing on interactional data, where it seemed to me that some students were given more time than other students, that was perhaps seen as controversial. So you know, I think that the international strategy jarred with the Office of Students, but also the Equality Act, which supports the needs of students with protected characteristics. There were also, I think, there was also resistance which related to language ideologies, Anglo-normativity referred to by Carolyn McKinney and others. It has to be in English. Again, this discourse of othering, if they choose to come here, they need to do it our way, and that's in standard, usually British English. Some colleagues, however, were very interested in learning more and would say, well, what do I do if my dominant language, and indeed my only language in some instances, is English? How can I help? Reflecting those language ideologies and monolingualism were comments relating to safeguarding. If I allow students to speak in languages that are their preferred choice, if we allow multilingualism from the bottom up in these classrooms, is there a safeguarding issue? Which seemed curious because we don't know in a discussion what everyone says or means or infers all the time. And then, as I've touched on, the important point around assessment. How can we assess these multilingual practices? They're not only text-based, they're visual. So I think questions I'm grappling with is, should, as in the example of Angela, should art practice and design practices, should these semiotic resources and the multimodal resources that are drawn on, should they be assessed individually? Do we assess the art, the painting, the sketches, the printing as separate from the communicative, the language resource that's presented? Or somehow is the sum of the parts greater, or sum of the whole greater than the sum of the parts? Should we be assessing holistically, which tends to be what happens through, which we've seen the crit spaces. And then finally, my researcher positionality as someone who I'm not an artist, and I present as a linguist and not an artist. Frequently I'm asked, but Victoria, what is your practice? And that question seems particularly culturally and socially loaded in the way that no, where are you really from? It's that kind of question. It demands a response. You're not one of us, so please explain what you're doing here. I think this lends itself to questions around how can we decolonize the university? What changes are possible at the moment? Scholars such as Medeve have suggested that academic decolonizing may not be possible. I think we can be optimistic, and I'll just end with my final slide. So I know we're out of time. The University of the Arts has recently, it's in its second year now, set up a Decolonising Arts Fellowship scheme. And rather than having outsiders, ethnographers, linguists coming into the institution and trying to understand, making the strange, the familiar strange and so on, there's an opportunity for art practitioners to engage in similar institutional research. So that's one way in which I think that the landscape can shift, and there's an increase in uptake, not only understanding the context and making sense of the context, carrying out high quality research, producing findings, discussing and sharing and disseminating with the social actors that we're engaged in, but also perhaps shifting responsibility from away from the linguist, the institutional researcher, towards individuals, like-minded individuals who are interested in decoloniality and decolonizing initiatives, as well as perhaps having an awareness and an interest in language and education policies. So I've been relatively brief, but I would just perhaps like to end, I think, just with a comment and a reflection on language. I would concur and agree, I think, with Li Wei's presentation around the importance of translanguaging, a shift in that paradigm for decolonizing university perspectives and decolonizing language, the language curriculum in particular. I do, however, wonder in different institutional spaces and in different disciplines, whether the let's say re-foregrounding, the re-centering of language as artifact also has a place in the debates around how we can embed research practice and research findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Another very thought-provoking presentation, and yeah, we are quite tight with time, so I will just remind everybody about the format. We'll hear our discussants after 5-minute break, so just a very quick break, and then we'll carry on. Yeah, there are needles and wine at the back if people would like to refresh themselves.
So we can because we don't be by people coming down. No, joining us a little bit later. People are enjoying their coffee break after some intense concentration.
Couldn't we wait? People get back. Huh? We have to go. Okay.
What time have you got to go?
1:45, so I get to.
2:05.
It depends on how much you have to
Well, if
say.
you talk for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Yelena,
Okay.
are you aiming to start questions when? What time? 5? Well, I mean, whenever you are done.
Whenever we're done.
So the only limit we have is actually Rita having to leave, which is, you know, yeah,
Okay, I'll be
understandable, but
You'll be lost.
exactly. Couple of more.
I'm competing with Chris. Is that right?
Yeah.
Christian wine, you know.
And wine, yes.
They win. I come second. I admit defeat.
But you found your phone. Which
Oh
is
my
great.
hallelujah.
Yes, so
I honestly, when I saw it, said on the sofa.
I thought she was unwell.
No, I want
to.
Yeah.
Because of the multiple
Okay, I think I might start. I might start.
So, welcome back, everyone. We are still waiting for some more people to come back from their conference break, but maybe we can reconvene with our discussants. Rita Lisa Vagliarvi from School of Slavonic and East European Studies here at UCL, Ben Rankton from King's College, Olga Voronina from School of Slavonic and East European Studies here at UCL, and Rachel Morley from SSEES as well. So the floor is yours, our lovely discussants.
Thank you very much. I have to leave at 1:45, so I'm going to start. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and my decolonizing practice, and then I'm going to react to each keynote one at a time, sort of thoughts I jotted down. It's not going to be criticism, it's more enthusiastic reactions and thoughts. So I teach Finnish language and culture at SSEES, at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. It's an interesting question why Finnish is based there and not in Scandinavian studies. There are historical reasons, of course, and there is an ongoing security reason, I suppose, also why we're there. But I've conducted research in Sami, 2 different varieties of Sami, the indigenous language of the North Sami and Piisit Sami. Also West Greenlandic and a minority language called Meänkieli, or minoritized language called Meänkieli, spoken in northern Sweden. And I've conducted fieldwork in each, and I very much myself had the experience of feeling like a fool, of becoming a learner. And I found that extremely useful in my own teaching practice because I can empathize with the students. So I'm always a learner of languages, and I can help students and sort of kind of deal with the emotions of feeling lost or feeling like a fool. I would also like to mention a couple of projects. So Esther and I have taught together Minority Languages of Russia, a course which is perhaps not participatory, but is research oriented, and also Howard's work, which is about verbal art, and then the students bring their languages to the classroom. And I'd also like to mention, Jelena also teaches Swedish at UCL, so there's some overlap between, for example, this Meänkieli that I mentioned, which is spoken in Sweden. We have an amazing project that I would call participatory, which is writing a textbook chapter. The students write the textbook chapter where they can recenter the focus of the typical language text. So this is wonderful. First, I'd like to mention that I feel that there are some institutional barriers to exploring minoritized languages in the UK. There's a big bureaucratic machinery, there's market research that needs to be conducted, and everything is monetized. So if I'd like to teach a course in West Greenlandic, which would be exciting, it is virtually impossible because of the process, the forms that need to be filled in and so on. It takes too long, and it doesn't necessarily fit into any kind of set program. So that is a big issue, and hope we can return to that later. In terms of my Finnish teaching, how do I decolonize? So I make sure that the text that I use, or the audio that I use, or the discussion topics that I use are decolonizing. They are inclusive. The topics they have to do with minorities, whether it be ethnic, linguistic, sexual, gender, everything. Students also conduct interviews, not necessarily in London, but the assessment, like Esther mentioned, it is participatory, that they themselves meet a Finn, could be online, a Finnish friend that they already had, and they talk to them. And another thing to mention about ethnography, that it's not always possible to, yes, go abroad or to even do it in London. There are obstacles like Sami speakers, there aren't many in London, so we're limited by that, but you can do digital ethnography, which is using social media in the same way. That's been extremely fruitful. And I very much like to kind of, because you talk about the Nordic countries as some type of utopia, they're not a utopia. There's internal colonization. So colonization doesn't happen always elsewhere in other continents. It can happen within these kind of glorified nation states like Sweden and Finland, who also have colonized in themselves. And the other thing I want to mention, 2 projects that are close to my heart, which are also decentering. They're not necessarily decolonizing, but they're decentering. which is partly non-binary language. So how do we talk about what terms do we use, which pronouns do we use? We organized a conference about this in June. And another one, that's what I was smiling, another one is bringing animal studies to the language classroom and bringing animals to the center of it. So I've given a talk about cats and language pedagogy in the past, but that's a separate point. I'm now going to go through my notes in reaction to each keynote. So the power relations, and kind of switching the power relations that Li Wei mentioned is crucial. And I think in the language classroom, we need to switch roles. I often ask my students to tell me, how is this in Mandarin? Or how is this in Polish? How is this in Russian? Do you have this? So I'm also learning. So that is not me lecturing at them or telling them how to speak and correcting them, but I'm also curious and I want to know how they say things. And this kind of comparative method, contrastive method, playful method, it is very good for changing power relations. And the other thing that really chimed with me and made me very happy was to hear that we want to challenge English, like academic English, the English being the main language at an international global university. Why should it all be in English? Why does English have to be perfect? Why can't we bring other languages to assessment and essay writing? And it is easy because I'm not a native speaker and my students are not native speakers, and we try to translate, let's say, a text into English. And that's okay, because I say, okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're not going to publish it, but we're practicing, we're learning the language through translation. And I'm not a native speaker either, so it's okay. It doesn't need to be perfect. So that was very, very nice to hear. And then Alison's method of learning a language, that was fantastic. But once again, there are institutional constraints. You don't really have the time or the resources for this type of method. Nor even if we did it as an extracurricular activity, putting up a play in a target language. My suspicion is, I don't know how the rest of you feel, that my students, at least, they wouldn't have the time for it. I can't see them, maybe I'm pessimistic, but I can't see them committing to such a project. Also, my groups tend to be quite small. And the MA groups that are bigger, they don't normally have the time. They're writing a dissertation, they're doing research in other things. So they're not majoring in Finnish language. So but we do send our students, BA students, on a year abroad, and we're hoping that they do something like that there. They do participatory things, they live in this environment. Same thing with summer courses. Of course, we can't control this, so it's our hope that they do it, but how can we ensure that they do it while they're there? There's also another way. I'm involved in a virtual reality project where this kind of play is done by wearing a VR headset. But perhaps, I'm not entirely sure yet whether that is better. It does help with the kind of uncertainty, and if people are nervous and they don't want to speak, they can practice. Whereas Alison proposed that we would just kind of throw ourselves into the activity and that way forget about our I don't know, fears or anxieties around speaking a foreign language. And of course, students vary. Like, once again, I'm thinking, would my students really do it and wear these outfits? And I find it hard to believe, but once again, maybe I'm the problem. Me and the students would be happy to do it. And then this physical pain, of course, makes it hard to speak, but also emotional pain and anxiety can make it very hard to speak. And I think the way to combat that is kind of creating a safe space. The language classroom can be a safe space, but also in a way bringing humor in, being kind, being empathetic. Language classroom has to be such a space. And then finally, Victoria, I was so excited to hear that an arts university has an applied linguist. This was the best thing ever. I was very, very happy. One of my sisters is doing a master's at Aalto University in Helsinki. And the master's is all in English, so they have an international student body. I've wondered, how did they deal with this kind of the mixture of languages? So both the staff and the students speak a language, most of them, that's not their own. And not only that, many of them have dyslexia. So how do you, do the kind of the visual side of things, that piece of art or design, and then you're meant to write about it in English, which is not your language. And it's actually very, very hard. And is it even a fair form of assessment? So should there be more oral assessment perhaps that the students speak, and that's kept separate? But in Finland, it's very much like the written culture, so they love to write whatever language it is in. And definitely, yeah, we need to reimagine that whole international education and what kind of English we use there and how we can be inclusive and include the other languages that the students speak. And it was sad that they stopped like you're not disseminating. Can we find it anywhere, the report? Or?
Yes, you can now.
Okay.
But
On
it
the
took a
dark
while.
web.
No, it's out there. It took a while.
Okay, thank you. These are my reactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Ben,
Who is next?
Ben, would you like to?
Okay. Well, I won't say, I'm not going to take very long because, you know, such rich presentations, I can't distill them all and people will have lots to ask themselves. And, you know, things I thought were terrific, like that slide of in Li Wei's presentation of the things that they're doing at the NCLE, like, you know, introduce conversations about racism in the French curriculum and so forth, language, multilingualism and the Holocaust. I mean, really terrific, great kind of conceptual openings up with, well, not just conceptual, but beyond conceptuals opening up with Alison's talk about kind of opacity and embodiment, Vakarongo and incompetence, all things that, you know, we need to think hard about. But I think I'd like to just concentrate my remarks a bit more on the you know, the institutional side of how things are workable. I mean, if we're talking about decolonization, seems to me we need to think about ways in which to bring this kind of discussion into the core operations of the university. And I would just say, you know, universities are a lot freer as spaces than a further education college or school, for example. So I think we need to, comparatively, we've got quite a lot of discretion over what we do and what we teach. And I'd also say in this context, I'm no longer just talking as a stuffy old academic because I spend 2 days a week working with a language and migrant rights organization, and I'm finding that actually quite a lot of kind of you could call it old-fashioned, Li Wei might call it old-fashioned stuff, cuts a lot of ice in those environments. And I suppose the question is, you know, tactically, if you want to change things in an institution like this or King's, do you stress the radicality and the transformation, or do you talk about the pedigree? I mean, good to hear Alison referring to all those anthropologists in the 1980s, raising questions about colonial representation. And, you know, I think that, you know, people were saying in the 1990s that language is a political object. That's not news. What we need to say to students is, yes, language is a political object. Now, here are some concepts and some frameworks and some examples of how to really analyze this and how to work this through. I mean, it seems to me that you know, stressing pedigree is rather, if we're thinking about the wider stage and all the, you know, war on woke and everything else like this, then actually talking about pedigree and you know, the caliber of the intellectual respectability of what's been doing counts a lot. And, you know, the same token, I wonder about Li Wei's statement about, you know, analysis just being all subjective. Really? I mean, why does anybody bother then to make a recording of interaction? And, well, if you've got a recording of interaction, is it just an interpretive free-for-all? Your opinion versus mine? I don't think so. I think there are certain ways in which people talk, and there are some explanation. You never get to the final truth, of course not, because there's always much more going on in any strip of interaction. But some accounts are much more plausible than others. Some accounts tune in better microethnographically than others. And I think that's actually rather an important thing that we can teach undergraduates, postgraduates, exactly as Victoria was saying, you know, invoking the founding figures from the 1970s and so forth. So I think and I'd like to hear a lot more from Victoria, well, not a lot more, but some more, well, as much as she wants to say, that's what I mean to say, on recentering language as an artifact, which you talked about, which I thought was really interesting. And I suppose, you know, a lot of very inspiring discussions, but again, you know, where's the replicability, or in what spaces can this happen? You know, actually, you know, one of the messages of Alison's presentation that really there need to be, you're not going to be able to introduce pain as a fundamental learning principle in all your undergraduate courses, because you're not going to get many students if you do. But there may well be space, you know, in a module, are there spaces where there can be more theatre, more drama? Plus, of course, there are, you know, there are vocabularies for talking about violence and insecuritization and so forth, that it is our responsibility to pass on to students so they can use them analytically to think about the things that they experience at first hand. You know, so I think that's my. I don't want to. I'm interested to hear what people say, but my. I think, you know, I'm very much inspired by Victoria's, you know, really kind of practical engagement with what can be done, where, how, what are the obstacles, and so forth.
I wanted to say thank you for thought-provoking, but also hugely enjoyable papers to all of the participants. And I wanted to reflect perhaps both on the Decolonising Language Symposium, which took place in May, and the one today. So, and the ways in which they challenge the simplistic perception of languages as language studies as tools or gateways for accessing a culture formed within the hermetically sealed borders of a nation state. Perhaps I think this was subject of conversation in May. At the same time, they problematize the power dynamics that are rooted, no pun intended, or that arise from the notions such as, for example, standard language, the relationships between bigger languages, and I speak here as a Russianist, and minoritized languages. So thinking to today's papers, I was fascinated by thinking and how we can bring some of the points made by Professor Livet about the fact that languages do not exist as separate structural systems, and the fact that named languages and named language learning is politically inflected, and the importance of communicating that to our students. I have no background in either linguistics or sociolinguistics, so really I think I'm here by virtue of my position as the inclusion lead at, or the EDI lead for the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. So that's my limited perspective. Now, Professor Livet spoke about social justice through investigation and understanding language practices. And thinking about EDI stands for equality, diversity, and inclusion. But recently there have been calls to replace the one E with the other. So the E which stands for equality, replacing it with the E which stands for equity. And I think if we accept that decolonization in Decolonising Language Studies is an appropriate and a fitting term for what we're trying to do here with Eastern European languages, to use that term, then I think there's a case to be made that the direction of travel is similar both for decolonizing initiatives in language studies, but perhaps more broadly, in EDI efforts and in our attempts to promote this notion of equity with its implication of social justice, So as opposed to, so not everyone has the same starting position. I should say equality, equity, decolonization is all contested terms. And I'm juxtaposing equity here to equality, which I suppose can mean that the same opportunities are available to everyone. So I also wanted to acknowledge the tension between, highlighted both by the organizers, but also by the presenters, between decolonizing initiatives and institutionalization. So I'm thinking here about Victoria's paper, I'm thinking about Alison's presentation as well. And I guess that as the inclusion lead, I'm always thinking about the how. How can we marry the initiatives coming from the concerted attempts to decolonize language studies with the position of administrative privilege that we have in an institutional setting to actually do something about it? So I'm really interested in this context in embedding approaches which hinge on the pedagogy of vulnerability. So learning how to start from a position of not knowing, the naivety and openness that I think fundamentally challenges the established power dynamics in an institutional language setting, but very narrowly in the classroom as well. So the ideas of open peer review, ways of knowing not tied to specific languages, which I think Esther mentioned in the very beginning. So addressing notions of language normativity, thinking from a position of an administrator or a managerial position. I'm also really interested in how we do this in the ways that the burden of doing this intellectual labor is not shifted squarely on the shoulders of what can often be self-selecting groups that participate in this effort. How do we make sure that this effort is not limited to the stakeholders, but that everyone in the institution is involved in this process, that everyone becomes the stakeholder? How do we use this administrative privilege to put it on the agenda, perhaps as a standing item on the agendas for all of our different program areas? How do we integrate it through, for example, again, thinking from an institutional perspective, perhaps a biannual review of our teaching where EDI is an item which is included and where you do have to put a tick next to it, you do have to consider it, you have to actively engage with it. So I was very interested in what you said, Victoria, when you said that perhaps an academic decolonization is not possible, or the not now, because I'm interested in how to do it now in this very short term. And what I think linked to all of the papers for me was this emphasis on openness through listening. So not pontificating, but perhaps listening. So embedding this participatory approach and also the EDI agenda. I think the final point that I wanted to make is that an EDI agenda, I'm really struck by the fact that it often looks very different to different participants. And so again, how do we ensure that the bodies which are in the position, in decision-making positions, how do they recruit consistently, aggressively, and as widely as possible to include that multiplicity of voices in the decision-making progress?
Shall I start?
Thank you all.
Okay, so I'm just going to speak a little bit about where I'm coming from, my positionality, and then pull out some of the points that struck me from across the three talks. And of course, thank you to everybody for inviting me. So I'm a colleague at SSEES. I teach Russian and Soviet cinema and culture mostly. I've also taught Russian language, both grammar to ab initio students, one of whom is in the audience, no pressure, and also translation from Russian into English. At the moment, I'm also the SSEES head of education. So like Olga, I'm sort of speaking with an institutional head on and sort of looking at these questions through how we can effect change. I love languages. I've learned languages right the way through school. So I'm going to be a bit anecdotal. So I apologize for that in advance. First, the points, first, Li Wei started by saying how exciting and original and transformative the work that my colleagues are doing is. And I just think that's worth repeating, because we need to keep repeating this in SSEES and more broadly, along with, as Ben pointed out, this idea that there's the pedigree, right? So that could be a tactic in our arsenal of tools for sort of saying, this is not just innovative and novel within the context of SSEES, this has a pedigree, it works. Let's spread it out more widely. The other thing that I kept hearing today, which is really important, again, it's sort of one of those commonplaces that it's sort of accepted, but again, bears repeating, and it's this idea of overcoming the normative approach to language. Alison talked about the difference between Hochdeutsch and Swabian. This was my experience learning German as an A-level student at school. My teacher had spent his year abroad in Hamburg and was a fan of Hochdeutsch. He told us never to say tschüss, we'd be laughed at. Right? If my teacher had come from a different bit of Germany, I would have been saying that the whole time, maybe getting laughed at, maybe not. But you know, it's that normativity that sort of tells you that bits of language are okay and other bits are not, that is tricky. I think the situation is changed a bit in schools. German A-level now includes different listening exercises with different sorts of German, but it's still reported that there'll be comments maybe from teachers or from other students going things like Swiss German's really weird, it's really hard, or this German's that, or whatever. So this idea of normativity, I think, is one that we need to keep stressing. That also made me wonder about how in higher education we're looking after heritage speakers of these languages. So Ramona spoke about the PIL project and about how one of the aims of that project is to give heritage, I'm not sure if that's the right word, even to give them pride in the languages that they speak at home. But how do heritage speakers fare when they come into the higher education classroom? Is their language being corrected? Are they suddenly finding out that things they say at home all the time or within the communities that they live in are wrong? Will they get marked down in the exams? So all of these questions, I think, are things to think about. We're quite used to hearing the other side of that coin, which is non-native speakers of the language that they're learning saying, I can't cope with all the heritage speakers in the classroom. It puts me off, it makes me feel inferior. You know, so there's these different positionalities within the classroom that I think we need to think about as well. Lee Wei, again, stressing the point that languages are political entities. Again, as Ben said, this is something that has been sort of discussed for years and years, but it's still important to keep reminding students and everybody about this in the context that we're working in the context of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and so on. The label Russian attached to all of our modules, all of our programs, even degree programs that students can study and complete without learning a single word of Russian or without reading a single Russian text. For example, we have an MA Russian and East European Languages and Culture, so we choose not to do Russian as part of that program, yet still Russian is there as the named language in the title of that degree program. And that's a political statement, it always has been, but it's particularly political in the current context. I can't remember, this was Lee Wei, I think, was talking about unequal Englishes. This is maybe where I'll be a bit anecdotal. So it links to the heritage speaker idea, you know, the idea and the assessment models that we use in universities that are unequal Russians, unequal whatever language we're learning. When I did my first degree, which is in French and linguistics, I'm not a linguist, but I did some modules in linguistics, which involved me reading Saussure and Sapir. So I know about the arbitrary nature of the sign, but I also latched on to, I think it was one of Sapir's theories, which was about phonetic symbolism. So where I was studying, I was from a Derbyshire secondary school in an academic context that was full of people from the home counties. I stood out, even though I didn't have a very strong Derbyshire accent, because I said bath, glass, grass, and everybody else said bath, glass, and grass. So I latched on to Sapir's idea that different vowels signified different sizes. Okay, so his experiment was meaningless words like mal and mill, attaching the word table to the meaning table to those words, and then asking people, was mal a big table or a small table, and was mill bigger or smaller. So I used to say, well, I'm having a bath because I don't want to waste water, or I'm going to have a glass of water because I'm not very, and it became a joke. And it did actually get some of my friends at university interested in linguistics who hadn't been before. But that's just a sort of anecdote about how this sense of inequality can come at different levels. I've got loads more points, but I'm just going to maybe focus on two more that sort of jumped out at me because they're things that I've encountered recently in contact with students, personal tutees in particular, but also students sort of just talking generally in focus groups that I've run. One is about assessment. How do we assess languages? And I've mentioned that briefly already. And this sense also that, or this point Leeway raised about how do we deal with knowledge that students have acquired from their own language work. So this did come up in the summer when some Chinese students had used sources in Chinese to write their essays for their coursework, but they were considered by markers to be unauthoritative because they'd never heard of the people who'd written these articles on particular cultural artifacts that they had asked the students to write about. They couldn't read the articles because they're in Chinese, but that's a big problem. How we go, that's knowledge, it's expertise, it's academia, these were published sources. How do we deal with that as an institution? And how do we validate students' use of that sort of thing? Assessment, this is Victoria's sort of points here, made me think about the institution and the Office for Students' legal position about having to use English in assessment and ensure that our courses check students' use of English. I think that's one of the B conditions that the Office for Students now. How about things like ungrading? We're bound by grades ultimately, but there's a freedom to learn movement. It's active in KINS, it's active in UCL, where colleagues are deciding that they're not going to impose grades on students' work, but they're going to be it's going to be a negotiated progress. Students propose their own grades, there's a discussion between the students and the teachers, and then you arrive at a grade that's a shared idea. What about peer assessment as well? Other speakers of Mandarin, Cantonese, or whichever language draw on their expertise as native speakers, look at their response to the artwork and see. So there's there are things we can do, again, tricky because this is an institution, but the ground, sort of the grassroots are there. In fact, we've got a conference in April on freedom to learn, so I'll share it with this group of people. And the last one is Anglo-normativity, and I say this sitting next to Olga, my colleague, who has taught the first year translation class from Russian into English that I teach normally, but Olga's teaching it now. So that's where we get Russian text translated into English. Anglo-normativity can work both ways. So the insistence on translation from a language being taught by a native speaker of the language we're translating into is not necessarily a productive one for students or for colleagues. You can speak to this better than I can because it's your experience, but if Olga's being challenged by native English speakers that her translation is not as good as theirs just because they're native speakers and she isn't, how do we negotiate that? Because my suggested translation can also not be as good as theirs because I might propose an idiom that I think is perfect as an idiomatic translation of the Russian, except none of the students in the class will understand it because I'm the age I am and they're the age they are and they haven't got access to that idiom for age differences or whatever. So yes, I think that's it actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I think we will have to open the floor
We can open the
to
floor
discussion.
to discussion.
The
and
timekeeping of
questions.
our discussions was so impressive that
Yes.
We want to have the speakers here.
Yeah, and we try to advise us. Yeah. And then if the audience has one question or not.
To the side, we disappear completely. A
A
little bit of change. Okay. We'll move up.
Yes.
We need more
So I,
Yeah.
I sit here. Actually, before Rita leaves, can I ask with an opening question? So she was the one who put it so nicely. Time and resource problems. And I would like us to engage with this a little bit, also linking back to many of the ideas that Olga and Rachel raised, and also Victoria's point about, from Monica Heller, that when there is resistance, it's always worth looking behind. What is the source of that resistance? Because on the other hand, I do find that what we want to allocate time and resources for, suddenly there are time and resources for. And thinking of many of the ideas that you raised, just as you were, Alison, talking about the plays that you staged and then translanguaging academia, I thought, well, we are really well placed to stage a translanguaging play. There were such plays even in the National Theatre about weird East Europeans coming into London, but it doesn't have to be linked to a place. That's the right thing about it. So I think these kind of things can be imagined within the constraints of our courses. Just I think some of the effort has to be moved towards more engagement rather than drilling. I find myself, I have taught beginners Hungarian for the past 20 years, actually more if we count my undergraduate years. I also taught English. There is a lot of it that goes into drilling, whereas this kind of situative learning that can learn from ethnographic insights can be actually time, sort of like a way to save time rather than to waste time. So I would like to bring this idea up of the time constraints, and I would like a brief answer from everyone. How do we deal with them? Because I think there is no question, this is not going to happen. But what do we do, at least narratively, what do we do about the resource and time constraints? While appreciating Ben's point that we are given greater freedom than in other educational fora, and we should cherish that freedom and turn it to advantage, I suppose. So I don't know who wants to speak first.
This relates to our previous discussions behind the scenes, so last Wednesday, we should propose a degree that would incorporate this. It would be at the heart of the degree. So if you modern languages with this participatory ethnographic framework, and that would be unique and different. And then there would be time and resource, because it would be the whole program.
Thank you. I would agree. Is there anybody who would like to challenge that proposal? Dan.
Yeah, well, then the Decolonisation initiative is nicely boxed for people to sign up, and the rest of us can forget about it and go home.
Can you expand on that?
Well, I mean, question on just a question about normativity. I mean, who marks your assignments, the assignments of your students? Do you send it off to an exam board, or is it you yourselves? You do?
Yeah.
You do, okay.
There is actually both. So we do internal marking twice.
Yeah.
And then external examiners.
Oh, no. External examiner is not an exam board. Sorry. An well, then you have to pick your external examiners.
Correct.
You pick your external examiners, and of course you provide the rationale, because you don't want the newspapers to get hold of it and say, oh, look at UCL letting people getting by with non-standard things. Well, you have your rationale ready, you show them the pedigree, and I would have thought that was a kind of just something local, where you don't have to set up a new, I mean, sounds terrific, the degree, sorry. It does sound really it sounds brilliant. I mean, but general point. And my general thing is, how is it possible to make things that we already do? How is it possible to turn things that we already do? Or where's the low-hanging fruit? And that question about examiners, who does the marking, is something that universities have control over, whereas they don't in schools or elsewhere.
Right.
Mhm,
Yes,
mhm.
it's a very important case in point. As Rachel was talking about how we choose our external examiners, I think there still is a requirement that our external examiners have to be based in academic institutions, preferably in the UK. So how inclusive is that? You know, why don't we also set, for instance, other users of the languages we teach who are not necessarily based in academia. They are based in, I don't know, wine bars, kitchens, libraries.
I think that's the main principle of quality assurance when the universities are compared each other's quality. And I think that's very important for the quality assurance of the UK, unlike other countries in Europe or elsewhere, where we look at the quality assurance and we compare, we talk to each other. And that's what externals are doing. That's the externality of quality assurance. And I think that's where it counts. So
It's true, but it's again the institution sort of,
of course,
it becomes a
course,
structure
but-
that's hard to.
but that's the
hard to-
tradition.
Mm.
That's
Oh,
the
yeah.
tradition.
And if you think about how other examiners, like the Institute of Linguists, for example, when they set translation or diploma in public service interpreting exams,
Yeah.
where do they find that, like Tigrina, for example, trying to find somebody to mark that translation papers in that. So they are more able to be more flexible in terms of sourcing where they get their examiners from.
And also it becomes, of course, problematic, and again, problematic even in the kind of unequal power distribution sense in the case of subjects where there is nothing to compare with actually nationally or internationally. As many minoritized or many, as we used to call them, less widely taught languages would suggest. But I think we have a couple of comments from the audience as well, so I guess it's Svetlana.
Well, I will build up on your question. Actually, I'll read the kind of a challenge that listeners' concept of doing something that is not just like traditional teaching languages, but actually more participatory. And now there's always this kind of like an excuse of time and resources. I would really like to hear more on real practice and how what's your experience of that? Because very often we approach institution and how it's set up as if like set in stone, nothing can change, as if all formal assessment has to be done in a certain way. And it's such a bit of a pressure on assessment that it actually take a lot of joy from learning, which we all know as kind of educators and so on. And I've been in a completely different capacity, part of co-designing a course for language and culture within International Baccalaureate Diploma Program, where we actually started from absolutely the same idea. We actually consulted Ophelia Garcia on translanguaging, and then Laura on anthropology studies, and so on. And the whole idea was, and part of our assessment, because I'm like external examiner for that institution for certain language and literature, but actually now I'm for designing this course, which is piloting now. And it was very interesting actually how within the exam components, you can actually center, it can be much more student-centered, So part of now their oral is not anymore oral presentation, but it's actually auto-ethnography, which they have to go into the community because we started with heritage languages, which were not offered in a group one literature subjects, so we have Navajo speakers who cannot actually take that subject within the diploma program because there is no written literature, because it's still orally passed on like oral histories. So how you actually allow students with a mother tongue entitlement that is at the core of this international baccalaureate kind of a curriculum to access their cultural practices and literature practices and language itself, So actually I think that we have to be way more creative how we educate and how we learn from our students. And I think that what Alison said during her presentation was incredibly mind-expanding and inspirational, meaning especially because academia is so much a cerebral place, which I think that everyone is kind of getting fed up, we need more visceral thing. And because I'm kind of a dancer as well, I know how much, body can help with learning. How you use your body. Body makes kind of embodied experience in embodied learning. So I would really like Alison to be given a chance to justify why certain things, formal assessment, should maybe have less priority for this kind of more experimental, thing.
Yeah. How long have you got? I'm going to start with what I was told all the time in a traditional, and I'm using that word advisedly, language department, language and literature. We're not in the business of teaching people to order a cup of coffee. So I went and did a tourist language class in those extracurricular, non-formal, non-assessed programs that at that point in time, normally it was the very badly paid wives of the professors who were teaching in some marginalized area. So absolutely sought out the margins and found there was absolutely phenomenal forms of teaching, far more exciting than the sort of stuff that I thought I was allowed to do in my classroom as a good girl. And that we were precisely in the business of teaching people to order a cup of coffee. In fact, that was a great place to start. And that when we were involved in activities that took us outside the classroom to go and find, I don't know, an Italian in an Italian bar who would then actually speak to us using those very first sentences that we'd learned that were, can I have a cup of coffee, please? That all kinds of stuff happened from that immediately made the language alive and the textbooks just become props, which they should be, rather than the meat and meal of what we were doing. And in many ways, I think that if we're really serious about decolonizing, we have to be working in the margins where we're not doing assessment. Assessment is a remarkably colonizing, remarkably centering, remarkably elite activity that we have exported all over the world. And yet when you look at the majority of the ways in which majority of people learn their languages in majority multilingual contexts, it's not like that. It's actually a peer process anthropologically. It's something that's going on and developing all the time. So the question here is, do we want good grades so that people get good jobs so that they can earn lots of money in a capitalist system that can continue those structures? Or do we really want to decolonize? And do we really want to decenter? So for me, it's been about, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And most of the time, I find that when I actually construct a really wacky, inspired course that's been inspired by my colleagues in low to middle income countries, by people in countries where they haven't written down what the curriculum might be, where they don't have textbooks, where language is taught in very different ways. And when I start to bring people in who might help teach in those ways, give people that opportunity, really different things start to happen, but they happen on the margins and the edges of the universities. Now, of course, we all know that the hidden curriculum is where the real learning happens. Now, assessment, grade acquisition, and all the rest of it, the stuff that gets you your career and ticks all the boxes, that happens in those central courses. But all the stuff round about, all the stuff that goes on in the year abroad, all the stuff that goes on in extracurricular activities, the stuff that happens in the film club, the language club, all that non-formal education, that for me is where the exciting stuff happens. That's where we're precisely in the business of the German beer club or the Alliance Française and those kinds of areas. And to me, I think that then leads to a couple of other things. I think when you're really first starting out, you really can do quite a bit of experimentation because you're on courses where you've got a lot of structuring in the universities to do that. You're expected to do your, whatever you call it, your PG cert or your PG dip, depending on where you come from. So those are places to experiment, to think about it, to write about it, to use that as a place of thinking within and push them, see how far the structures will go. Think about what your own theory of assessment tradition is, where it comes from and who it's serving. Because those are the places where we'll answer the really radical questions about decolonizing. And then for people at my position, as a senior researcher, now with a global position, I get to say, yes, guys, you can do this. Because you can, because I'm here to tell you you can. I'm here to tell you we have an annual UNESCO Spring School. The world comes. It's the most extraordinary place of doing exactly what we've been talking about, of feeling pain, of feeling heat, of feeling warmth, of experimenting, of workshopping, of doing it in multiple languages, of not knowing what's going to be there, of experimentation that is both creative workshopping and language workshopping, and is done with and alongside people with clinical psychological backgrounds who can make sure we're doing it in a way that is safe and enabling and is led by largely people who have sought asylum or sought refuge. And the final thing I'd say is that it's also incumbent on people like me to fill in an awful lot of forms to get the money so that experimentation can happen and so that we aren't just stuck in a assumed theory of tradition or an assumed theory of curriculum or an assumed theory of assessment, which we barely reference. My colleague Barbara Schmenk is working on this at the moment and just looks at all the ways in which we posit radical curriculum moves without really thinking through what's this straw man that we're talking about? Does it really exist? Or is it actually something that we're just allowing to be a spectral haunting, as Vern Harris says, something that we've just let instill us with fear and prevent us from doing anything other than something central to what is essentially still a colonial, imperial, capitalist agenda. There are ways of staying safe, doing the safe work that ticks those boxes, but absolutely lets us do much more that is fun. And I think the book for me that really instantiates this is what was my book of the year last year. Charles has heard me say this before, but David Graeber and David Waingrove's wonderful, wonderful book, The Dawn of Everything Towards the New History of Humanity. And they look at the way in which we tell our history of how we came to be human beings, how we came to speak, how we came to act, how we came to write. It's anthropology, it's archaeology. And they just go, this history we've discovered is really mostly wrong, extremely dangerous because it imposes a linear theory of civilization, of going from hunter-gatherers up to us, you know, so civilized as we are not, and actually is really intensely dull. And it doesn't have to be like that. So what would it mean if we brought in that playfulness to our curriculum? I was able to do it because I said the very last class, that's what you're working up to. It's not assessed. But that's where we're having fun together. That's where we're putting in place a common task. And nothing builds a decolonizing community like a hard common task. A common task where we will make together and we will perform together and we will do it for us in the spirit. And again, this harks back to Maus and to David Graeber's early work of a gift economy. It also looks at Anne Carson's work around reciprocity. What does it mean to mutualize? What does it mean to put reciprocity into our classes? That genuinely does some decentering. It requires some decreating, and it may allow us to do some decolonizing. But those are the kinds of moves that I think we need to make, and they need courage to do them, but they also need playfulness, and they need some opacity, and they need us to be good at doing what we're all really good at doing within modern languages, which is telling a good story about what we do, and telling the story that allows it to fit within the safe mechanisms, ensure that the students can get the grades that they need, but also ensure that we're doing something that actually begins to look like decolonizing. And my worry is and I'm kind of with the moves that say decolonizing curricular moves from the top aren't going to work, because they're going to be within those tram lines. It's in the informal, it's in the hidden, it's in the non-formal, it's in the community-based curricula. It's where we have ethnographic projects that go out and work with migrant centers and work with Chinese language supermarkets and all of these other amazing things which we've seen out of the, you know, translanguaging projects, and the project that Li Wei was involved with, and in my own, which was researching multilingually. Those are the places where we're going to see this happen. It's possible, it's here, it's amongst us, it's been ongoing for, you know, a good 25 years, and certainly 10 years since we brought in the Translating Cultures projects. It's becoming an orthodoxy, and I think we should take that and move with it, because that is our resource. That gives us time, and that gives us the ability to do it.
Just very briefly,
Rant over.
Before I ask Rachel to comment, because she signaled she would like to, I would just like to mention something from our own example. When we we at SSEES ran a course for the UCL Global Citizenship Program that centered on the Danube region and languages in contact along the Danube region, and many of my colleagues who are present here contributed to teaching on that program. either on culture, literature, or language. And it was absolutely linguistic ethnography based. So our students were going out to the communities. And I think it's very instructive and comparable to what you are saying, that one of the main concerns with our program, as opposed to other programs where students were, I don't know, sitting in a safe UCL classroom doing animations about, I don't know, environmental issues. One of the main concerns about our program was how are safeguards secured? How are students going to stay safe if they go to see a Bulgarian priest? You know, I mean, that's obviously extremely absurd, but that was not only about the Bulgarian priest, but these concerns were raised. So, but how do we secure that our students are safe if they leave the UCL campus and talk to these strangers? Because kind of go out to the park a little bit, that's kind of fine, but like how can we safeguard our students if we let them talk to strangers? So that was number one concern. And then when the program was successful, the next question was, you can't do this on assessed courses. And I kind of don't think that. I think this is one of those points of resistance. To my mind, it always was that Victoria mentioned that, of course you can. I mean, this is not something that you can't make a part of your assessment. And I'm kind of glad to see again at least 3 or 4 nodding heads from my language and linguist colleagues that you can invent such forms of assessment even within the centered forms of assessment and non-dynamic forms of assessment that can accommodate this. I think you can trick it a little bit, because I do have a worry about, yes, this comes from the margins, but and I totally agree. That's what Jelena and I wrote our position paper about, that served as the basis of the spring discussion, that this is something that has to come from bottom up somehow. Decolonizing can't happen from the center. By nature, it's a contradiction of terms. But at the same time, I think there is negotiation with the institutionalized frameworks. And I am personally particularly intrigued by those points of tension, which you have all expanded on, where you can push the framework just to accommodate something that should, that in principle or according to the norm should not be in the center, because I think it is possible to kind of center from the margins, so to speak. And I think that kind of tension can be very productive and kind of provocative on its own. And also, of course, there are then resource implications. If everything has to happen in extracurricular forms, then there are implications both for teachers' workloads and lecturers' workloads, which is a very boring argument, but at the time of fraction contracts, it is a very real argument nonetheless. And there is also the other side of the coin that a place like the UCL, say, other universities, they now lure students with so many types of stuff. I think I'm not wrong if I think that on induction week, there was a pole dance tent set up in the main quad of UCL. And it looked like a main concert in Hyde Park was just about to begin. And then I tell them, come talk to some Hungarians who work in the park here. I don't think so. I think it has to, so I think for practical reasons, but also for theoretically productive reasons, it's good to kind of bring these things in line with the center somehow. And Rachel, sorry.
I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to say thank you for bringing the word joy into the conversation, because joy of teaching and learning is something that I think these structures can repress. And it is one of the themes of the conference that I mentioned already today. But also said that I agree with everything Alison said. And I think one of the things that maybe connects what you're saying is that we over-assess our students formally. And that if we can get rid of quite a lot of formal assessment, it will free up the spaces that Angela has identified where the actual value-added learning happens. So maybe capstone projects, one big assessment for the whole year, and sort of requirements that students have to meet. But that would be,
if engineers can do it, which is what a whole year of their degrees are, surely we can.
Yeah. And also, thank you for the word community. I wanted to quickly comment on that, kind of like engaging for a common cause or a common task or a common, sorry, I have it in my notes. I may put it, but actually, Jelena and I wrote a paper on our own experience at this summer school, where the sort of single most important value for students from this global citizenship summer school was that they could work in groups and they were completely invested in the common task, which in our case was not performance. It was kind of like various creative projects that enabled reflexivity. So they made portrait photographies, ethnographic interviews, and portrait documentary films as well. But I think what was really overpowering is that they became a community only in the span of 2 weeks. And in terms of assessment, I won't be able to cite the paper exactly now, but the South African linguist, sociolinguist Leketi Makalela reports in one of his papers that in his research site in the village, when kind of Anglo style or Anglophone or Western style methods of assessments were brought into school, obviously, they decreased students' engagement and they increased rates of failure. And I can't remember whether this was something that one of his local collaborators said, or it was Makalela himself saying, well, in our community, we do have education that we provide to the children. And so, yeah, they can fail, but if someone, just one of us fails, the whole community fails. And I think this is a very nice altered look on assessment. And I think many of us do experience that if our students fail, we fail. So we fail in smaller groups.
I mean, I think this is very interesting, and I certainly agree that the neoliberal university is a mess and not very nice place to be, and we overassess students and learning is commodified and so forth. But is that I mean, I agree with that, but I can't see from what some people are saying if there's any place at all for a university. Is there a role then for the university if there's no, I mean, what if people do want to have degrees? And, where does ethnography get, how do people find out about ethnography if there aren't universities kind of teaching it? Sounds to me, I mean, I do think we've been a bit too radical. I mean, I think Alison's strategies about where you do things is great, and not to disvalue the spaces that aren't off the curriculum. All that's really important, and I think I also think the universities need to be much more open than they are to the kind of extracurricular things that their staff do, if their staff want to bring them in. So I think there's lots of ways in which university can be flexibilized, but if everybody gets a degree at the same time and we all get the same degree, I can't see how that would work. Seems to me.
Suggesting that, and the way you kind of phrase it, the language you use by saying extracurricular, you in a way marginalize these kind of skills, values, approaches, and so on. So the moment you kind of in language designate something or attach this label extracurriculum, you are devaluing it in a way.
Well,
yeah? Because there are like
okay,
things that the curriculum, and then these extra side things that we might do, might not do, might kind of.
Well, to be fair to me, I did hit. I mean, there was a distinction made between the buying a cup of coffee, language teaching, and other kinds. The language teaching that happens in a assessed module. Now, maybe the extracurricular was the wrong word to use, but
we have to be very careful how we use language.
No, that's nonsense. That's nonsense.
Can I get my point across?
Yeah.
Are people killed or are people dying? In a current affair, what is happening in Gaza and so on. Are these people died? How many people died, or these people are killed? We have to be very careful how we wrap our thoughts and ideas and beliefs in language. Yeah, we're linguists, okay? So I think that it is something there, like embedded or implied when we call something extra curriculum, because then we come to the canon and how curriculum come into place. Who decides? Let's see about the ideology. Who decide what is to be in a curriculum, what is going to be taught, and what can be kind of just added as a little extra value or added value. We really have to.
So I think, sorry, I think this was a little bit addressed before.
We are talking hierarchy here. If we talk curriculum and extracurriculum, we are employing hierarchies in something that we are trying to abolish. Anyway, is it or is it not?
I think I agree with you, your sentiments in the sense that if the important work takes place in the margins, which is what you're advocating, I'm not suggesting that it can't or it doesn't, but if that's where the important work takes place, and at the same time, if decolonizing the university, the language studies curriculum is a much more deeply envisioned and radical project than, say, EDI, for example, or previous traditions, then my concern with maintaining, with kind of this maintenance, is that the canon and the privilege and the institution remains intact.
Exactly.
So for me, it's quite it's not that the work doesn't take place, bringing the outside in, but the center remains untouched and intact, and then therefore the decolonial project will fail.
Is it possible to marry the two? And I'm actually going to look to Maya for I don't know, just thinking of a wonderful example of, I think, Slovenian speakers coming to the university, participating in events where the language is being taught through a fairly formal setting, and yet also those contemporary writers that are brought to the university setting, students engage with their, so I'm speaking about past projects linked with the study of this language. So contemporary writers are invited to give talks about their books, and students are then involved in the process of learning the language and translating those new, previously untranslated works into English. And then their translations are assessed in the university setting. So in this period of, I don't know, is there no space where those two agendas can meet, the institutionalization and those assessment practices, and a very successful example of teaching
so those were those productive tensions that I was trying to refer to before.
I think that kind of marriage is possible.
So to come back to Ben's point about do we need a university, I think we need places where people gather, and I think we always have needed places where people gather. In Shona, they're called the Dare. In Te Reo Māori, they're called the Marae, and they are the place where you would have a wānanga. They have different names in different cultures, and it would be great multilingually if we could maybe employ some of those terms for them, but we absolutely need places where we learn to think and think again and think again and think again, and think particularly at this moment in time, historically, how we undo the epistemic violence that elements of the university have been complicit in, whilst at the same time absolutely offering hospitality to the kinds of knowledges that mend and heal and enjoy and enable the kind of restorative work to continue. And I think it's very much about context. So I'm listening to this in London, and whenever I come south, I'm always struck by how tentative the conversations are compared to our experiences in Scotland at the moment. We're a multilingual country officially. Gaelic, sign language, Doric, Scots are all languages, as well as English, obviously, are all languages which are official. They've gone through the Scottish Parliament. They're enshrined in law. This gives us many points of contact. It then means we've got to ask ourselves a question. Okay, well, how are we going to use Gaelic in the institution? You should have seen the resistance. Oh my goodness. But we have actually managed to get to the point where Gaelic is not italicized and forced to bow down to the English. We managed to put it up so it's straight. Yeah, this was a revolution. These are institutional processes that we can be involved in, but they are slow and they take time, and they need committed working committees on the institutional side They need the marketers to go off as they did when we had the Gaelic language plan. And I said, we absolutely need a bilingual website. When you come to the landing page of the University of Glasgow, it needs to be in Gaelic and in English. And the marketeers went off and they went and tested it out on the fee-paying students, and they all went, oh no, we only want English. Now they're saying they want Gaelic as well, because they really value Indigenous languages, and because Indigenous languages are seen in a different way, and because UNESCO's now in the middle of a decade of Indigenous languages, and it too has done that thinking and careful institutional work, which is incredibly painful. I'm here to tell you, I'm sitting in those committees, 11 ministers of education, 192 member states. They can't agree on what a language curriculum can look like. It's actually a bit like being in a room like this with everybody passionate about their model, their idea, their way forward being the way to do it. But you see these committed processes in committee with people with resource who are able to deploy it, where arguments are tested out and people have learned to argue well and argue rigorously and do their research and bring them together. It's a problem-based language teaching initiative. The majority of the time that we spend in the Gaelic Language Committee at the University of Glasgow. But equally, we need sites where we can really unthink the epistemic violence, and mostly our students are helping us do that. Now on campus at the moment at the University of Glasgow, it's all about the investment in the arms trade. That's the big issue. Before that, it was around slavery, and my institution was the first to do a major piece of reparative work and engage in restorative justice practices. How did it do it? How did that come about? Because activists in the community asked the university to look at its land holdings registers and see where it got its money from. And then the academics they were speaking to lobbied the Senate, and it took about 8, 9, 10 years. And then the Senate said, okay, we'll make a bit of money available to do the research in economic and social history, because that's where it needs doing, to develop a methodology for doing restorative justice. We'll do this academically, we'll use what we can, but we'll do it about these issues that have been brought to us. That's where these elements all flow together. And you end up with languages, economic and social history, restorative justice, institutional politics, higher education for the 21st century, movements of decolonisation, anti-racism studies. And as a result, we have buildings named after the first African American to study in the United Kingdom and have a degree. We have a program of race equality studies. We have a program of scholarships, we have connections with particular campuses that are based on social justice. It didn't come from nowhere. It came through these committed processes, came through rigorous research, but it came through thinking in these non-curricular ways and saying, what can the university do? What is the piece that it has? How can it do this? How can it be a little less implicated in the epistemic violence that it's been implicated in the past? So I think it's all possible within what we call a university, and in other places might be called something else. And it's these circles that we keep
and I think
reconstituting.
Yeah, and I think, epistemically non-rigorous research that is epistemically non-violent, that isn't violent epistemically. I think that seems to me something that is thinkable and is something that a university should do. But nevertheless, rigor needs to come in somewhere. And where does that? How does that get in? How do you decide what's rigorous and what's not non-rigorous? I mean, that is a complicated process of assessment.
Maybe give some more
Yeah,
questions
yeah.
from the
I
audience.
you wanted to react, Victoria.
No,
didn't you?
okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
There is-
yes, I was trying to do that. Thank you. But you are welcome. You have to go ahead. Yeah.
I hate to be the person who says this is less of a question or a comment, but here it goes. Because I think Esther is at the very beginning of this whole thing talking about assessment of AI and how we kind of more generally probably need to reevaluate how we assess students, just because the same way in which it was quite I don't know, assessment was very restricted to in-person exams until very recently, just because there are very few ways to check whether, if we did it any other way, the students would just, let somebody else write their exams or use resources. that they're not really familiar with, and they haven't really understood, right, but still are able to produce a text that looks fine and academically rigorous from the get-go, right? And I experienced this when I was on my year abroad in Bosnia, and the university had the resource which I've turned it in, so everything was assessed on knowledge-based in-person exams, which was painful. But obviously the institution had only this possibility to assess people, and with UCL and many UK institutions turned in was this point where we can check whether someone just plagiarized, at least to an extent, but now with kind of large language models and their success, this is also put into question, right? So we might have to move to a way of assessment that comes away from, well, you read this and you read this and you know this and you know this, to a kind of form of assessment where we can actually say there is not only knowledge and understanding, but also application and abstraction. And once again, yes, I think I totally agree with what has been said about this is much more resource intensive for the individual educator or assessor, but it does ultimately make for a learning experience that is much more fruitful. And I think it ties in with a lot of what that has been said, just rethinking what we're actually testing when we're assessing somebody, and only saying that, oh, these two people deserve the same degree because they scored similar enough marks on a test of, I don't know, Russian morphology, right? Morphology is very good because there's a very right and there's a very wrong answer usually.
There is a reason why we test it so vigorously. Yeah.
Exactly. It's very it seems very objective to mark, and I can't really offer any conclusive solution. I wish I could, but I think just rethinking what exactly it is we're assessing, right? And that's also ties in with what Victoria said, right? If you're a monolingual speaker assessing a multilingual artwork, your impression of it will be very different than what another multilingual speaker might have. I think there even the kind of question of aesthetics of script kind of came out, right? The associations one person might have with Chinese characters that are very exotic and maybe remind you of a Chinese restaurant or your one time that you went to Vietnam. Is a very different thing of what the artist actually tried to do, right? In embedding her experiences and her multiple identities and the kind of like conflagration of them. So yeah, kind of trying to rethink who is assessing, why they're doing it in the way they do, and what's ultimately being measured are probably questions that are quite crucial to decolonizing and moving forward in a world where a lot of things can be reproduced by third parties. Sorry, that was very.
Okay. Should we take the question online?
Yes.
Or if anybody wants to
React to this.
respond to Fabian.
If anybody has any thoughts.
Well, I just remember a wonderful lecture I went to where which was looking at plagiarism belts that were constructed in a particular village in Italy. And they were very elaborate, and the whole village was involved in making the plagiarism belts for people to be able to wear during the exams. And they would spend, and the students would spend ages writing down the answers that they knew were coming. They were usually open book exams that had been set, but then they weren't allowed to take materials into the exam. But the fact of making the plagiarism belts into which little answers were tucked and could be secreted out during the exam and written down meant that the learning had happened.
That's how I acquired most of my undergraduate knowledge. At MA level, invigilated exams were reassuring.
I mean, I used to, at university on AI has just said, yes, please use it. Tell us how you're using it, reflect on it, come up with a theory of usage of AI. Tell us what you've done, tell us how this is different to what you would have found had you been in the library and developed your work. So rather than going, oh, it mustn't go anywhere near it, forbidden fruit, so everyone will go after it, it's actually said, let's incorporate it and think about it. Yeah.
And Olga
I'm just thinking from an EDI perspective, two reservations about using AI, or perhaps the reason why we need to think carefully about including that in our assessment models. First of all, who owns the information that is used by large language modules that are then used to, where does this information come from? And secondly, there have been discussions about the fact that if any information which is found online by those modules containing sort of biases or prejudices, they will then be reproduced uncritically by those. So we need to think very carefully about before we change the assessment modules. As always, thinking from an institutional perspective, I think we need to think very carefully about what the implications of using AI.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Google Translate started getting really good at a number of languages, certainly via English, good 10 years ago. And then they started saying, hello, sort of take-home translations don't work in the same way anymore. And I remember spending hours trying to correct Google Translate. And then I stopped. I thought I'm not going to do any more of that. And then people kept saying we should think about this. We should think about COVID was actually a brilliant opportunity for this specifically, I think, to rethink language assessment, particularly the areas that are linked to translation. It didn't happen. So COVID came, COVID passed, new models of assessment were introduced and then sort of put aside. And we are back to exactly the same examination model. So students happily translate away with DeepL or Google Translator an increasing number of tools. And then we assess them on something that they didn't practice, and we are all trying to be very creative in preempting that. But I think the key questions that Fabienne suggested are very important also in this respect, and also in the study of translation and, going back to translating culture and mentioning Clifford several times today. Sort of what is translation about, and who speaks in the translation. Maybe engaging students in those questions, and I don't know, maybe bringing in a native speaker to class and having the translation. Native speaker, I mean, not the nativism, but like, a non-academic user of the language. That's what I wanted to say. To see how well they would rate the translation produced following these tools. I don't know, I haven't thought about this particular overlap before, but I'm sure there are. I just would kind of imagine that by taking by being in charge of their own learning through a community engaged learning project, students would want to sustain that degree of engagement rather than trying to sort of increase their exposure to the learning tools. But I think an important function of academia, actually, to come back to that question, and an important function of universities is to teach in the classes how those tools work. Not necessarily make them part of the assessment, but critically, use AI tools critically. How is a paragraph written by AI about, I don't know, translating cultures? And if you read 2 paragraphs yourself and summarize those, how do they look different? So I think that's a huge place for universities there.
There is a question in Q&A from an online participant here for Alison. Assessment has been a key consideration here. Alison Fitch referenced the legacy of the Intercultural in 1904. My institution in Mexico still uses an intent designed in the 1960s. What will the colonial approach to language assessment look like in the future, and how do we exercise the goals of the native speaker from it?
That's a PhD.
Yeah.
I mean, I am struck by the fact that we are talking about decolonizing from within one of the key perpetuators of the colony, and that actually what it might look like requires us to look at it from a different place in the world. And so, you know, my own work takes me a lot to low to middle income countries, former colonies. And you walk into a library on campus and what is it full of? But all the same books as we learn. And so, and what do we find that people are wanting to do? They want to come to the UK to study, and what they will get is a colonial curriculum that will teach Western methods of epistemic violence, which are then enthusiastically employed within a global South context. So we really do need to think very carefully about what we mean by decolonizing. I think a lot of the time we do try and say it's inclusion. As long as we're managing to have scholarships for people to come and study here, we must be doing decolonizing. Whereas actually we might just be continuing to perpetuate the same models. It needs a really deep critical approach. And I think that means actually working in contexts where, where we see how people are able to come to rigorous understandings of knowledge that they share in gathered spaces that enable them to heal and to raise children and to teach and to critique and to do politics and economics and all of the other things that we've turned into disciplines in our institutions, but to do them when most of those structures that we take for granted are not present, cannot be present, and there's no money to do them. And I think, I look at the University of Zimbabwe has just closed the departments that teach the Zimbabwean languages so that the only language taught is English. And that's the legacy. So decolonizing surely means doing some work to ensure that that language somewhere as intangible cultural heritage is sustained and continued and unable to be learned. And that means working with diasporic communities, that means working with partners in the global south, that means thinking in different ways, that means, not accepting a library as a transplant, but saying, what is a library? I'm doing a talk on Sunday about precisely this, what does it mean to think of a library beyond being books or IT, but actually the way in which we have the archive of the body, the way in which objects carry knowledge, the way in which idioms and proverbs are places of curation and archiving. There are so many other ways, I think, in which we can think of this. So to really answer that question online, I mean, that's how I think we might banish the ghost of the native speaker, by really centering and thinking about what do people in other contexts with other forms of knowledge need and want, and how those things might be balanced, and how we come to common idioms, but also are able to see what the legacies are and begin to undo some of them, because they're utterly tragic.
But also, yes, the notion of the native speaker is interesting because it depends on the position of the native speaker. So a native speaker in what context and against whom? I think that's an interesting question also. Is that the native speaker of, say, a heavily endangered language?
I mean, against 20 odd years ago, we were talking about the intercultural speaker and the intercultural listener. And the work that I was doing with Mike Byram and others, there are other ways of having concepts which may not center nativism in what they're actually proposing.
Which is an interesting challenge, I think, also for language documentation and language endangerment, because the nativism and how perfect your language is still an interesting case.
Any more questions from our audience or comments?
Yes, I think Charles.
Yeah, just a more localized sort of question. I'm just thinking about the UK. Generally speaking, I think what we have to say that languages or modern languages do face a lot of issues, declining recruitment, an argument that we're all familiar with since, of course, that we disagree with, but which is there, that since English is in many ways a lingua franca, do we need to be so concerned about learning other languages? These are strong arguments that one hears in the university. And in some respects, as a disciplinary community or subject, I think we are contending with very strong material sources that are quite language indifferent. But at the same time, I think we can be critical of some of the ways that we do things. I think in order for there to be a way in which one could combat some of these arguments, this language indifference, reliance on English. You have to absolutely to convey the topicality, importance, decolonial significance, the excitement, the necessity of being switched on, engaged with, prepared to listen and learn languages as a fundamental human asset, but also a right. But I don't think we're going to sort of get that message across very successfully if we defer to some of the ways in which we've done things for a very extensive period of time. And one of the things that I think it is absolutely necessary to do is to think differently. And I think this is events of this kind of extremely valuable because they are encouraging and taking forward that thinking differently. Some of the things that we do need to do are decreate or indeed possibly fetishize a little less some of the structures that pertain in our universities. The ref, for example. I mean, yes, we all live within the context of that ref, but it does provide an excuse. I'm just concentrating on my next research paper. I don't have to think about some of the really deep societal issues that are necessary if one gets through this kind of participatory research, this kind of more radical thinking. And the other thing that we need to do is to get beyond some of the competition between universities. Antonella Sorasha says one of the things that she hates about British universities is the ethic of competition. We need a much more community-based sense of the university if it is to really perform the mission that has been talked about extensively and very extensively in a session of that kind, is its community societal engagement. So I think that there is a lot of self-criticism that we do, and creative self-criticism.
And generally across language studies and sectors, Charles, as well. I mean, we were talking about modern foreign languages, but why not mention ESOL as well? And Ben has done quite a lot of work there. And there is a lot of overlap between what you were saying, Alison, today, and some of the methodologies which are extremely forward and avant-garde within ESOL, and also building on sort of older thinkers and methodologies. So,
but you're right. Yeah, I mean
that kind of dialogue is necessary as well, because there is the work that you have done as well within communities. There is so much to learn from that as well. So there is that dialogue to be had as well.
Yeah, but in a way, the most participatory work happens outside heavily regulated institutions like, schools, FE colleges, and so forth, in the third sector.
Rachel, did you want to say something? Yeah, the acronyms. Sorry, I just got stuck on that point. NSS, Rachel, and REF. And recently I am trying to learn CMDs. Does everyone know about CMDs? Yeah, so all you see, I think it's continuous module dialogue. What is it? Continuous module dialogue. And that's again something that we can sort of, it's basically, sort of almost trying to do, I don't know, I don't even know how to begin to describe it. It's sort of using a computer tool to anonymize students' responses to questions that we ask about our courses. And one of my students is kind enough to be with us here today, and she knows I failed trying to do it because of the technology. But I think there is a lot of ideas here around trust, that came up earlier when we were talking about a translanguage in university or a translanguage in institutions, and what happens in a classroom when students are allowed to speak a language that we can't monitor, I have a class this year where I am the only person whose strongest language is not Mandarin Chinese. All the rest of the students speak it as their first language, native language, and home language. And we use it a lot in class. So probably that would fall into the not pedagogical translanguaging, but translanguaging pedagogy approach, as we heard from Levi, because that's the way we can proceed at all. But yes, there is no way for me to monitor what is being exactly said. What I do know is that the questions that emerge from discussions that were had in Mandarin, they are relevant questions to the problem. So, you know, even if there is a lot of talk about other stuff, there is also a lot that is relevant to class content. So I'm trying to learn a challenge, trying to turn a challenge into advantage and just kind of try to listen what students say, as you put it. But continuous module dialogue, you know, in which language should we have that as well, you know? And also sometimes I do feel that these acronyms, they are there on their own right. So trying to think as a linguist about the acronyms, what is the message behind these acronyms? They sometimes seem to be terribly exclusive and directing our attention towards the center, I think, because so there is on the one hand, you know, issues with, you know, not non-English native speakers perhaps using English in different ways from native speakers, but then there is also the kind of jargon and the kind of register in which we move. And sometimes I go to a departmental meeting, and as I was on maternity leave just before COVID, and then there was COVID, and there were all these new acronyms, and I suddenly felt I didn't belong anymore, you know, because I thought, okay, I will never break through that wall. So I don't know. I think this is a broader question in general, but there is, I think, another layer here to participation, you know, whether those acronyms are there to allow people into the center or keep people away from the center in some ways, and what that implies. For example, for a long time, I didn't know what EDI was, as I had too much teaching last year, so I couldn't come to the meeting.
If I can just propose something that I found really largely effective as a strategy or a tactic. I mean, it's not a strategy. We're not on the winning side. De Soto is very clear on that. It's a tactic. But I've actually found something which I kind of think is a form of bureaucratic activism within the institution quite helpful, which is really about just challenging committees and asking, saying, does this actually fit with your EDI strategy? You know, and asking the question, you know, and kind of, you know, being a little, you know, playing it a little bit naively, but just asking the question. And often that's been a really good way of getting things changed. So I did it recently around the PhD for publication, where the PhD for publication at Glasgow was something that you could do if you had been employed in the university for 5 years on a full-time permanent contract. So I asked the EDI unit, how many, what's the breakdown of men and women, ethnic minority, white on full-time permanent contracts, and of course it was 80% men. So they therefore had to change the regulations to allow it to be part-time Black and ethnic minority women and white men to be able to take a PhD by publication. And that was it was really quite simple to take those strategies which are powerful and which we've, you know, my great-grandmother was fighting for back in the day. So they're small things. It took them a year. They had to change the calendar. That's this document from 1451 at the University of Glasgow. But they did it. It went to Senate. Everyone agreed. And then, you know, I asked the question on the ethics form. I said, surely you need a box on the ethics form about languages. And what are you going to do if you have a researcher who's researching a community where they do not have the language in common? And I thought I phrased it reasonably well, and that this would allow us a space for considering the ethics of multilingualism. The first iteration came back and it said, what are you going to do if your participants don't speak good English? but I rest my case. We were then able to go back and we gradually, bit by bit, you can get, and changing a box on a form. You know, if you've ever read Ben Anderson's wonderful book, Imagined Communities, you know, you can see how much is changed by just changing a box on a form. So, you know, bring that critical discourse analysis to bear on your institutional forms. And it's amazing what can happen. Just nudge it over. And people like to feel good about having done something. You know, particularly a lot of our wonderful academic related staff, they're sitting there going, what else can we do for our refugee background students? What else can we do for our international students? And if you give them a new box to create on a form. The joy that is produced in a sector of our institutions that love making forms, they must do because we have to fill in so many, is really great, and people can take credit for that themselves in their committees, and so you build a community that's actually trying to do EDI in a real and bureaucratic way using the tools that we have, because the way we get things done is bureaucratically. So whether we like it or not, we have to be good bureaucrats.
Before wrapping up, does anyone have anything to say to this? Because I do have a last question to everybody in the room, actually, and particularly to those colleagues who teach language as well as subjects like literature and culture and society style of courses. So my question is, and I can be the first one to answer if you want to, because I do realize I'm putting you on the spot, but what is it that you think you or we can take away from today's discussion or this discussion and the previous symposium and implement in practice in our teaching? I don't mean here in our research, I mean it in our teaching. Is there anything, what is it that you think you will implement or that you think we should all implement that would be to the benefit of our students, and including to perhaps engaging our students better so that our degrees somehow become more relevant and attractive to them?
This is where we need mentoring.
Because that people will not answer.
That technology would enable everybody to submit their answers and then have a nice word cloud of all the different solutions that people have. Yeah. Maybe we could do a Menti and circulate the link.
But I would
to
also
attendees.
still nonetheless wait for answers if anybody wants to. Yes.
The bearing in question with sometimes tensions practice standard way the glass
Do you see yourself, let me be specific, do you see yourself doing one of these ethnographic projects or staging a play, or, if it's a literature class, having the students on the last class critically act out the characters we talked about, writing from the anti-hero play, I'm thinking, but also for those of us who teach language, do you see yourself enjoying getting your students to do these mini ethnographies? You can say no.
I think it depends on the students.
Yeah.
Because we've got such small classes. Sometimes I've got, or maybe that's what Czech language, that's what I teach, like I trust students. But I start like when you said that you the poem, like what inspired us to read this one. So I started with my students to dedicate like a few minutes at the beginning of a session, like 10 minutes for students, and I basically instructed them, you don't need to if you're, of course, shy, and I'm kind of socially anxious as well, so it's not my nature, to kind of go and follow social media in that language and bring a meme or something, or even a grammar if they want to, or whatever. First, it has to be something that's related to the language, and then we can spend like 5-10 minutes on the class and do something, and it can lead us to like an hour of derail, but actually it's not a derail. But sometimes it's just over very quickly. It really depends on the student, and sometimes they don't have anything, which is fine, and I can.
Yeah, I think this is really good, and it supplements what we were
Something
thinking.
also because it's not necessarily Czech community is quite reserved, not very organized in London. There's not many opportunities for them to go to. I mean, there are, of course, but not as many. And so I thought, like, the internet is there. And
So you will not be performing Czech characters. You will not be performing them Czech characters. They will not.
no, well, yeah, I can push my students towards it, but yeah.
It's very inspiring what you were talking about, acting out different situations, which we always language teachers we do, because we ask students to say, okay, so now you are the shop assistant and you are going to buy things.
sometimes not sometimes, but in one-to-one tuition, you ended up being the shop assistant, your etc. But now that I've heard your talk today, very inspiring, and it was like a performance itself, like storytelling, an interesting genre of presenting something in academic institutions. So I was inspired that maybe students, I might ask them to pretend that they are some favorite character, like some cartoon, or I don't know, some the thing that first pops in my mind is like Winnie the Pooh. So if you are Winnie the Pooh, how would you like approach the topic, the very boring topic of the death in tax for Bulgaria? Yeah. So and try to explain it to the tiger with the tiger in the class, etc. So maybe this kind of animated situation. And another thing that I was that inspired me, what Esther said about the Latin school, that she was one of the organizers, that the students had to do these kind of ethnographic projects, the portraits. They had to choose some important, or not really important, some native speaker, and to portray them, to take a picture, and then to do a movie, like to record a short film. So maybe this one again, I'm going to.
So this was contextual, not of course for students to copy the linguistic practices of the native speakers, but the native speakers of our languages in London at the time, or the sort of heritage speakers, tended to be from less fortunate or less prosperous communities. And the point was to engage with those communities who give a very different model from academic ways of speaking.
And a similar project my students had to do in your previous fact, when they had both meet the Bulgarian priest, and they were so excited about it. So this project, I think that if we find different people that are inspiring because they are native speakers, and every one of them would tell a different story of their life. Those kind of linguistic biography.
Narrate Winnie the Pooh from the using the voice of the Bulgarian.
And I was thinking about what Alison said today about when you have to learn a language and when you have to be assessed from a translation through a second language, like Chinese students, for example, doing Bulgarian, and some of them, they have really very good level of comprehension. So they understand the text perfectly well, but then because the English is not that great, and I wouldn't say my English is that great, so I would never judge them that harshly, but we have second examiners, we have externals, and my second would say, well, but the English is not great. But what are we assessing actually? The level of comprehension from Bulgarian into English, which I can see is excellent. But then the English is not communicating this excellency, sophistication, etc., proficiency. So this is not fair to students. So we should reconsider this and give the chance to people to be their comprehension to be assessed fairly.
That's a really important point, actually. And again, I was thinking as people were talking about the way we mark the Russian into English translation, there's an extra 3 marks up the grabs for fluency of expression, or so who gets 3 marks? And it's not necessarily the students who've understood the Russian more, I don't know which word to use, but as you're describing the Chinese. So, but that's within our gift to change, except it takes a year to do it. It's processes, but you can change that. That's up to you.
William, I think, but
yeah, actually, just exactly on that topic. So I submitted a form to Rachel the other day, which was a project about translation, and part of the assessment was assessing a translation and also assessing a selective essay on this translation. And now I'm thinking, one of the big problems was that this would be open to students in different languages, which I need to develop them, obviously, and need input from colleagues. But also, now I'm thinking that maybe
let them translate into a different language. I can send it back and you can change it.
Translation in the English text. Because maybe it should be
just the reflective essay.
Maybe translate in different directions. Maybe
that would solve the word count problem and the assessment level model.
in one of the courses on intercultural language education that I taught for a while, we decided not to assess the translation, but to require a translation. So it was a requirement that a translation was done, but how good or bad it was not what was important.
Yeah.
What was important was how good the critical essay was with its references about that process. So the task was, you can do whatever you like. There's one thing about it, you have to care about it. So we did that thing that Bell Hooks says, you know, when Eros is present in the classroom, love is bound to flourish. And we said, what do you love? And we had, you know, somebody who said, I came to Spanish, I wanted to learn Spanish because when I was 14, I started reading Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and I thought it was the most amazing thing. And I loved this one passage and I wanted to translate it. So I learned Spanish and I went overseas and then I could do it. And then I did my own translation. And then I read it in the original and I was disappointed. And I had this extraordinary essay on Eros, on desire, on language, on Marquez, on her own upbringing, on her positionality. I mean, absolute straight A, because we were grading, on a brilliant reflective essay, because it was written about something that was cared about and a lot of time had been put in outside of the classroom. And somebody else went up and translated the back of a yogurt pot. And this was the first thing they saw every morning, the first piece of translation.
That's really interesting.
They saw every morning was a yogurt pot, and they did this critical analysis of the translation on the back of a yogurt pot. Now, these essays were very different, but they were actually very similar because it was a reflexive piece that was important, not the translation. But the translation had to have been done. And I literally had people turning up at my door with yogurt pots because they wanted to bring the original, and that's what it looked like. And then their translation, and then the reflective essay.
What they watch. I think we actually do have a little bit of a similar project on our language courses, and I think this kind of dialogic form of reflective reflective essay on the translation. I think that's really good without assessing the translation. Rita mentioned that we have a course on the minority languages of Russia, and there is a Nivk folk tale about how the rat and the cat fell out because the cat stole the fat that the rat wanted to eat. And one of our students translated it on the course years ago, and obviously it was very hard to evaluate that. I mean, how good can a translation from Yifkin to English get? And instead so he wrote an essay on what he did and why he did it and various levels of analysis. And I think also this paves the way to more dialogic forms of assessment. I really believe in it, sort of like not the mark as it's set by some rule book so much, but what is your level of discussion and how deeply engaged we are. I mean, it's very hard to do when you have 500 students for a subject, but
much more in iProofs.
It is. It's iProof, and it's actually engaging with that critically with epistemic life.
I think I should let Jelena wrap up. Do we have any more questions or questions? No. Thank you.
Could I just make one comment? Really interesting. Thank you to listen to your thoughts and reflections on your own practice. And I think listening to you, I'm reminded of, I think, Ben's work and Constance Lung's work, where you've talked about sort of loose frameworks for thinking about change and thinking about particular contexts. And the question that popped into my mind is, in relation to back to decolonizing, is whose participation is enabled, and I think that perhaps relates to sort of the regenering or the introduction of hybrid and new genres, and the introduction of languages that are not known. I think it's of Glissade who talked about sort of making people work a little bit harder, and that's perhaps appropriate, and therefore legitimate to not know. It's so really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I might just add something. So I graduated in May, and so I did my 4 years sort of across COVID, all that kind of thing. And I was actually really quite disillusioned with my experience here, particularly in the first 2 years, more on the Spanish side of my course, where it really felt like everything was by rote, and there wasn't really any sort of inspiration behind it. We were writing things out, that kind of thing. for the symposium earlier this year on decolonisation, we were asked to go and do an ethnographic study. And we went round, Ramona and one of the other students that was with us, we went around and we did this sort of language trails a project with the Romanian immigrant community in northwest London. And we met a priest as well. We met some. But it was deeply fascinating. I myself, with Romanian, already have a lot of ties to the language and the culture over there, the people over there. But there are so many people that come here, particularly, I think it was a gentleman called Charles that was speaking about it. Why necessarily as a first language English speaker should you bother learning a second language? That's very much how someone would feel turning up to Spanish or whatever language, learning by rote. They've never done this sort of thing. It's just something that they were getting good grades at before, so why not? I'll get a degree in it. Doing these things is what inspires people to actually go. I mean, me the other day, I had a Romanian lady come into my work and she didn't speak any English. They told her to actually come back so she could speak to me. And I was like, how on earth do I talk about this field in Romanian? We've never covered it. And so I'm talking about the thing and the stuff and the that and this, you know, like and I had no idea, but that inspired me to go home and I looked it up and I found out, and it's the life behind the language that it helps you find.
I think this is an amazing note to
Yeah.
end everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers. So Victoria,